بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، صلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا تأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. اللهم إنا نستهديك لأرشد أمرنا وزدنا علما ينفعنا وعملا يرفعنا وأحوال وأخلاقا ترضى بها عنا يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم افتح علينا بحكمتك وانشر علينا رحمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. صلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Okay, alhamdulillah. So a warm welcome to everybody to our the first of our new set of sessions, inshallah ta'ala, which is provisionally titled the Rasa'il Readings, where inshallah the hope is that we'll use this as an opportunity to get through to get a deeper understanding of the tradition through a reading of a variety of Rasa'il, various epistles and treatises written by the ulama at different stages, throughout history, and on various legal issues, points of fawa'id and the like. Epistles like this, which relate to some type of fadila and the like, and it's related fiqh, and sometimes on legal theory and other issues as well. Inshallah, hopefully we'll try to look at different things at different times, but it's really just an opportunity to explore something of the tradition in more detail, because sometimes popular texts and the like don't necessarily go into some of the nuances and details, because that's left for a later point, and they might sometimes end up being differences of in manahij, differences in methodologies and trajectories with respect to the ulama in responding to certain questions and the like, which you don't necessarily see unless you kind of explore the tradition in further detail. And so far, when I've covered various rasail in kind of settings to date, it's been well received. So inshallah, so this is why alhamdulillah, I decided that we will try to continue inshallah with keeping up some readings. I'm not necessarily guaranteeing that some regular kind of reading, although in my mind I'm provisionally thinking that we'll do this on a monthly basis. So whoever wants to join us is able to kind of join and benefit. What I will kind of mention, of course, is given the nature of these types of readings, including today's, it's not simply kind of just oh, let me just hear what's going on over here, because it sometimes ends up being a lot more technical, so it does sometimes require a bit of a background. And of course, in doing these readings, I'm also kind of assuming somewhat that you have a bit of a background in some topics, because otherwise trying to go سيروا على سير أضعافكم at the pace of the weakest of you. I mean, that pace might not necessarily be possible if we're trying to get through something in a reasonable amount of time. Also, I'm trying to do these readings. I'm giving myself till so 2 hours for this. Inshallah, we'll see how this goes. We might or might not have a short break in the middle. Probably have a break just to kind of stand up, sit down, whoever needs to kind of stretch their legs, have a breather for a moment. So inshallah, we'll probably try to do something like that. But we really just want to do a focused reading of this, and recognize that there is some nuances going to bring up many questions. Not all of those questions will be able to fully resolve right now, because this is not a book of fiqh, right? That's the other thing to remember. When there's a risala being read, it's not it's simply sometimes just expressing something, but it's not necessarily always showing you everything. And sometimes they are kind of speaking from different perspectives and the like. So that's also useful sometimes as well. The other thing to note is that I'm not here to give a full tahqiq of every single issue, right? So whatever risala we read, if you're expecting that I'm going to give you like this full tahqiq of it, I mean, that's not the purpose of the readings, right? Because sometimes for those types of things, you have to get the different perspectives as well, right? So it might be that some ulama are saying one thing, and other ulama are saying something else, right? So to really understand what exactly is going on, you have to go and get the perspectives of the ulama first. Well, actually, even before that, you have to kind of explore the issue first and understand what's going on, and then begin to examine what the various positions are and why the ulama are choosing certain positions at certain times and sometimes in certain contexts, right? So and there are various reasons for this, right? And so this is also important to keep in mind now as we're doing the readings, that sometimes there might be other perspectives which the other ulama have written about, and that's why I'm framing this more as an opportunity for us to kind of have something of a discussion, like more discussion based as we go through. Not necessarily that we're going to stop on every single masala and sit down and discuss, because that's going to take a really long time, naturally. But at least if people are engaged, and if you have a question or comment or something, then inshallah we can try to run with that and explore that as well as we kind of proceed through with the various issues that come up. The nature of even a book like this is that there are all kinds of issues, right? So he's kind of jumping around all over the place, like I mean, it's organized, but in the sense that, sometimes talking about one issue and then he moves on to a different issue, then he moves on to a third issue, and it might be that other Rasa'il that we read at they might sometimes just be focused on a single legal issue, sometimes might be on a whole topic. So it depends. I mean, I've already got the second one in mind. It's actually sitting right next to me. But inshallah, that will be on a single mas'ala. So inshallah, we'll do that next. I'm not sure if that will happen now before the month of Ramadan. I'll have a think about it, see if that's possible. I hope that it will be possible, inshallah ta'ala, to do the second one as well before the month of Ramadan. But inshallah, we're here today to do this first reading. It's also worked out that I am a bit slow. I do apologize. So of course, at this point, um, most of Rajab has pretty much elapsed. Th 3 weeks or so have already elapsed. But inshallah, there's still, as the ulama say, أصلح ما بقي يغفر لك ما مضى. Right, so just take care of what remains, and you'll be forgiven of what has been, what has passed. Right, so inshallah, we can still benefit something, right? Because at the end of the day, the best moment and the greatest moment is this moment right now. Right, is the moment right now. So if we gain something, we benefit something from this class, inshallah ta'ala, and one thing we can implement and practice in our lives, then we would have gained a lot. Because at the end of the day, it's not simply for factoids, right? Ilm is not there for factoids. Ilm is there for us to actually learn, to transform, to change, and to apply. Right, so this is the point of it. And of course, sometimes the nature of the issues is that it might be quite technical, so it's not that a practical application necessarily is required, but the idea is that sometimes it can simply some clarity can manifest in one's heart, and there's the i'tiqad, for example, with respect to that particular issue. There's the ta'zeem, right, which you can have with respect to that issue, and so on and so forth, right? So there's other ways of manifesting appreciation for those types of ahkam beyond simply actively applying them. Well, I can't apply them, therefore I can't do anything whatsoever. ما لا يدرك كله لا يترك كله. Right, so that which can't be fully attained, then it's not left altogether. Rather, there's other ways that we can actually benefit from such things as well. inshallah ta'ala. So this first risala now that we'll be doing today, and of course, as I mentioned, sorry, just once again, that do feel free to join on camera if you wish to be with us, and and if you have any questions or comments at any point, then do post them, inshallah, and I'll be happy to address them. If it's too you know, it's too unrelated, then I might not necessarily give you know, any significant response to it. But inshallah, I'll attempt to kind of respond to all the questions and comments which do show up in today's session. So today's risala is is titled al-Adab fi Rajab, right? So the propriety or proprieties in the month of Rajab. That's what he termed it, and the author is, as you can see here, Ali ibn Sultan Muhammad al-Qari. Right, so this is popularly known as, of course, Mulla Ali al-Qari. Mulla Ali al-Qari was an 11th century scholar from Herat, from Afghanistan, and he ended up being in Mecca. Of course, that's why he is also Mecki in terms of his nisbah. And of course, he was a scholar of the Quran, and he was also a calligrapher. And that's why he would actually write out the Quran and on a yearly basis, right? And he would sell like one or two or three copies of it. And basically, the proceeds from that, you can imagine the kind of proceeds that he was getting from that, would last him the entirety of the year. So he could busy himself with in knowledge and writing and the like. And of course, Mulla Ali al-Qari is is one of those really special encyclopedic kind of scholars where you really see him writing on pretty much everything. So in terms of like he has you know, works on in aqida, he has works in fiqh, he has works in tafsir, he has works in hadith, he has works in mustalah al-hadith, he has works in qira'at, sharh on tajweed, he has like you name it, sirah, shama'il, like you name it, Mullah al-Qari has like a risala on it. And that's why his Rasa'il were actually published by Darul Adab in Turkey. Perhaps a few years ago now. I can't remember how many years ago, but maybe 4 or 5 years ago now. And his whole collection of Rasail. I'm not sure if they got everything. It's probably unlikely, but they certainly got enough to fill, you know, to pack about 7 volumes. So that's a pretty significant amount. And you know, he has Rasail in there about loving cats and all kinds of stuff, right? So all kinds of weird and wonderful issues. The ulama, really, it's just any opportunity to kind of write, and this is their thing, to be honest. You know, sometimes we don't find enough time to read, but it's incredible the kind of barakah that they had in their time and the kind of things that they were able to write. So he really is an incredibly impressive scholar who is you know, he's also impacted by Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, who's also a Meccan scholar, a Shafi'i scholar who comes before him, who also has important books. So you can see his in various books. He's doing another sharh that Ibn Hajar al-Makki al-Haytami has already done, like for example on the Mishkat al-Masabi, and he's doing istidrak, right? He's kind of making comments based on what Ibn Hajar is doing. And then, of course, he has his own additions and the like, undoubtedly, which are always beneficial. Similarly, his Fathul Mubin, his commentary on the 40 Hadith. Sorry, I'm getting confused even with Ibn Hajar now, because Ibn Hajar's Al-Fathul Mubin. And Mullah Ali al-Qari, his was also printed again not too long ago, actually. Again, you can see his sharh on the Shama'il. Similarly, is you can see that there's connection to Ibn Hajar. So it seems that he has something there where he has some type of connection and maybe some type of love, some appreciation. But of course, Ibn Hajar was like one of the foremost of these scholars. Right, of this Meccan period of the, you know, so Mullah Ali al-Qari is coming, you know, right after that. So There's a really nice nas which I think Ibn Abidin, uh, Muhammad Amin Ibn Abidin, who is the final Muhashi, of course, as they refer to him, as of the Hanafi school, who has this massive gloss, the Rad al-Muhtar, which is the Hashia on the Dur al-Mukhtar of Ala al-Din al-Askafi. So he actually quotes Mulla Ali al-Qari as saying, he says, فَوَاللَّهِ الْعَظِيمِ. Right, so this is Mulla Ali al-Qari now. These are his words. He says, فوالله العظيم رب النبي الكريم إني لو عرفت أحدا أعلم مني بالكتاب والسنة من جهة مبناها أو من طريق معناهما لقصدت إليه ولو حبا بالوقوف لديه. Right, so he says now that he says, by Allah, right, the Lord of the most the generous prophet and the noble prophet. He says, if I knew anybody, right? He says, anybody who is more knowledgeable than me with respect to the Quran and the Sunnah from the perspective of their ma'ani, right? And their words, like outward words, that I like outwardly and inwardly, that's what he means. He says, I would direct myself to them, even if it meant that I had to go on all fours, right? Even if it was like crawling to them, as it were. He says, وَهَذَا لَا أَقُولُهُ فَخْرًا. He said, I don't say this out of boasting and pride. He says, بَلْ تَحَدُّثًا بِنِعْمَةِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى وَشُكْرًا. He says, but in order to express the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and in order to show gratitude. It's fascinating because I think Badr al-Din al-Aini also has a statement about this, right? About from shukr is to share one's knowledge, right? Is to express of one's knowledge. This is also from the shukr. So, you know, you can see multiple ulama kind of expressing him, and he's, of course, a good 150 years or 160 years prior to Mulla Ali al-Qari as well. So he says, وَأَسْتَزِيدُ بِهِمْ مِنْ رَبِّي مَا يَكُونُ لِي ذُخْرٌ. Right? And he also seeking an increase from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, وفي كلامه ابن عابدين now وفي كلامه إشارة إلى أنه مجدد عصره. Right? وما أجدره بذلك. Yeah, and he says, he says, ولا ينكر عليه ما هنالك إلا كل متعصب هنالك هالك. Right? So Ibn Abidin, what does he say? He says, and in his words, on the indication that he is the mujaddid, he's the reviver of his time. Right? He's a reviver of his time. And how deserving he is, Ibn Abidin says, of such a station. And he said that nobody denies this except somebody who is simply has something against him, right? And somebody of no status, somebody who's just jealous. So this is Mulla Ali al-Qari. So he's pretty significant, and this is his risala on the adab in the month of Rajab. So inshallah, let us begin. So he begins here on page 23. Before that, just the editor's kind of notes and the like. To be honest, I'm not really paying attention to the editor's footnotes and and his criticism at various points. But instead, you know, we'll see what some of the ulama said about the various points that he makes. Because sometimes editors, when they edit certain books, they've already made up their mind about something. And then they simply use things to express what they've already made their mind up about. So at the end of the day, it's better to kind of objectively kind of see what's happening and then to see what other ulama as well are actually saying about this particular issue. And like I mentioned, this is not like a full tahqiq of all of the issues that he will mention over here. That's not the purpose of this, but the purpose is that for us to kind of apprise ourselves of the kind of masail and the things that he is mentioning over here. And I will, inshallah, be alluding to various things. And as I mentioned in the initial introductory post, that one of the key moments and moments of pause will be when we start discussing the Salatul Raghaib, Right, so this is actually one of the key reasons for reading this, because initially I was actually planning on reading the Rada al-Raghib, and the Rada al-Raghib, and that's why I mentioned that we'd be dipping into it. This is عن الجمع, what is it? Yeah, في صلاة الرغائب. So initially I was going to read this, but then it occurred to me that actually the second risala I wanted to read was actually by the same author, Nuruddin ibn Ghanim al-Maqdisi. So in order to change things up, I decided that I'll read Mulla Ali al-Qari on where he actually brings up the issue in the middle of this risala, so it actually fulfills the same maqsad from that perspective. And then we'll kind of dip into that just a little bit, just maybe I'll share something from that. And then inshallah we'll kind of proceed on and read Ibn Ghalib next time with the the next the next time we meet for the next risala inshallah ta'ala. So Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I'll try to generally translate as much as I can, but not necessarily every single word for word. That's just part of the nature of these Rasa'il, and then I can also, in the interest of time, so please do bear with me, and inshallah, hopefully it's enough to kind of get the gist of what exactly it is that he's saying. So Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. فقال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا به وبكم آمين. He says الأدب في رجب didn't appear to be a basmala, at least in this edition, but then he says الحمد لله الذي خلق الكائنات على هيئات متباينات فأظهر الفضل فيما بين أفرادها ظاهرات ومعاينات حتى في الأمكنة والأزمنة وسائر الأشياء الحادثة من العلويات والسفليات. Right, sorry. وما ذاك إلا بحسب التجليات الواردة وفق الأسماء والصفات. Okay, so he's sending praise to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one who created all things in different manners and manifested some type of merit to some of them and distinguished them in that way. He says sometimes, he says even in places and at certain times, and he says in all things of the upper realms and the heavens and the like and the lower world. And he says, and that's all in accordance with the manifestations. He says, and that's التجليات الواردة وفق الأسماء والصفات, so in accordance with the asma and the sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says وأفضل الصلوات وأكمل التحيات على سيد الموجودات وسند المخلوقات وعلى آله وصحبه وجنده وحزبه الطاهرين والطاهرات وسائر المؤمنين والمؤمنات أما بعد. Yeah, of course, it's on the screen, but I'm just using my physical copy in front of me as well. So if I'm looking down, that's where I'm looking at my physical copy. But inshallah, I'll be moving through the pages over here as well, so everybody knows where exactly we've reached. So then he sends blessings, peace and blessings upon the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, the leader of all created things and the support of again created things. And he says وعلى آله وصحبه وجنده وحزبه الطاهرين والطاهرات, and his pure folk, and he says and all of the believers, men and women. He says to proceed فيقول المتجع إلى حرم ربه الباري. So you can see how he is ascribing himself again to the haram, right? So we talked about him being Mecca. He says Ali ibn Sultan Muhammad al-Qari al-Hanafi. عاملهم الله بلطفه الخني خفي وكرمه الوفي. Yeah, it's nice how how he connects himself, that when he makes dua for himself and his father. So Ali bin Sultan Muhammad al-Qari, and he said عاملهم الله, right? So the huma is in reference to himself and his father, right? بلطفه الخفي, right? By his hidden gentleness and his complete and surpassing generosity. So he says, the first title, of course, if it's in brackets here, it's from the editor. It doesn't appear that this is part of the text itself. I'm not sure if it's in the other edition. I don't think it is. So in the other edition that we posted onto the group, you can see how it's just straight blocked text. That's why I actually like this edition, because the editor actually put in, made it easier on the eye actually to read it. So he says here, So he says Rajab. So I'll read, just because it gives us a sense of what's to come. So Rajab bin Ashhurillahi al-Hurum. So he says إن الله سبحانه قال في كتابه القديم وخطابه القويم بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إن عدة الشهور عند الله 12 شهرا في كتاب الله يوم خلق السماوات والأرض منها أربعة حرم. Yeah, so the first thing he wants to mention is that Rajab is from these sacred months, right? It's from these inviolable months of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he mentions this verse, and this verse in Surah At-Tawbah. So he says that the number of the months according to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is 12. And he says in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, since the day that he created the heavens and the earth, and he says that 4 of them are sacred and inviolable. So he says, وَهِيَ رَجَبْ وَذُو الْقَعْدَةِ وَذُو الْحِجَّةِ وَالْمُحَرَّمِ. Right? So what are they? It's Rajab, Dhul Qa'dah, Dhul Hijjah, and Muharram. So he says, Wahidun. Second. So he says, Wahidun fardun wa thalathatun sart. Right? So one is by itself, and 3 are consecutive. والمراد بالسرد مطلق توالي والتتابع ومنه ما في الشمائل للترمذي. So he's going to mention something related, which is just a general linguistic point with respect to the idea of sard. So he mentions here that what sard, initially he says that it's just the idea of something being consecutive, one after the other. Right? So he says, and there's something in the Shama'il of Imam Tirmidhi where he says, وَلَمْ يَكُنْ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامِ يَسْرُدُ فِي كَلَامِهِ كَسَرْدِكُمْ. Right? The Prophet ﷺ, he would not simply speak continually, as it were. He says, as you would, but rather he would separate between his various phrases so that it would be clear to the listeners what exactly it was that he was saying. Right, so this is the idea of why he mentions the sard over here. Also, with respect to these months now, they how they would work, and I think he's gonna mention something else shortly. But basically, how it would work is that the Qa'dah, they said that this was the month where they would simply stop fighting, and the Hijjah would be for the Hajj, and then the Muharram, it was Muharram now in the sense that it's haram to engage in any fighting whatsoever. And Rajab was simply a month that the Arabs deemed to be great. Right? There was a time of that they deemed it to be an extremely significant time of the year. Right? So this is why it also, of course, that's not the reason why it's in the Quran, but the idea is that there's a sense of like the Mufassirun actually explaining that this is something significant, and it's something that was known at the time as well. So he says, فلا يرد أن ذا القعدة وذا الحجة في آخر السنة والمحرم في أول السنة الأخرى. Right, so he says, so it doesn't really make a difference, right? Because the idea of sard, so he's just responding to an objection now. So what's the objection? Well, Muharram is the following year, so it's not really in order. It's like you've gone to the end, as it were, of the months, and then you go back to the beginning, right? So that's like it's almost like you've gone backwards. So he's saying no, it doesn't matter that it's the following year. Rather, this is still. That's why he said mutlaq at-tawali, that it's just generally in this continual kind of order. Everyone with me? All good? Everyone's here? Okay, alhamdulillah. Okay, good. Okay. So let's see. Okay, so then he says مضاعفة العمل الصالح والظلم في الأشهر الحرم. So multiplication of righteous deeds and also of bad deeds, right? Evil deeds. So he says ذلك الدين القيم فلا تظلموا فيهن أنفسكم. Right, so this is the right way. Of course, this is just an extension now. The completion of the ayah, right? The completion of the previous ayah. It's the right way. It's the right calculation with respect to the months and so on. He says, so don't wrong yourselves therein. So he says, أي في شهور السنة عموما بفعل المعصية وترك الطاعة وفي الأشهر الحرم خصوصا. Right? So he explains now, just generally throughout the year, he says by committing sins and the like and leaving acts of righteousness and piety and obedience, and it's specifically in the sacred months, right? في الأشهر الحرم. He says قال قتادة, right? So one of the early writers there. So he says. He says العمل الصالح أعظم أجرا في الأشهر الحرم والظلم فيهن أعظم من الظلم فيما سواهن وإن كان الظلم على كل حال عظيما. Mm. So what did he say? He says now that righteous deeds are, he says, um, will receive a greater thawab, he says, in these sacred months. And he says, and dhulm, right, and sin, wrongdoing, oppression, literally, he says, is far worse than, but of course, in this context, he means sin. He says far worse in these months than it is in the other months. He says even though it's bad at all times, or it's as he mentions, azim at all times, like it's always considerable, it's always terribly bad. But the idea is that far worse in the sacred months. So this is what Qatada says, and of course others of the ulama, they also mention a similar thing, sometimes even without Qatada, like Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, for example, also mentions this in his Jami' al-Ulum wal-Hikam. Right, that's also published in English as well. So he says, Al-Qitalu fil Ashhur al-Hurum. So fighting now in the sacred months. Are you battling actual war, not like fighting with your kids or something? Right, and just like play fighting. He says, واختلف العلماء في تحريم القتال في الأشهر الحرم. So it says the ulama now, they've differed with respect to whether it's haram to engage in such, fighting in the sacred months, in these inviolable months. So he says, فقال قوم كان حراما ثم نسخ بقوله تعالى وقاتلوا المشركين كافة أي عامة كما يقاتلونكم كافة كأنه يقول فيهن وفي غيرهن. Right? So you fight the disbelievers or just as they fight you. So he says it's as if يقول in these months, right? And he says and also outside of these months, right? Outside of these months. And he says وهو قول قتادة وعطاء الخراساني والزهري وسفيان الثوري. Abdul Ahad says here, what does qawm refer to here? So he actually mentions it here. Right, so this is a group of the ulama, and then he actually mentions like some of the ulama over here, Qatada and Ata and Zuhri and Sufyan al-Thawri and so on. We'll actually see Abu Hanifa as well. This is the Hanafi position on it as well. This coming in just a moment. So he says, وقالوا, let's see, إن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. So it's also one of the proofs that they use for this. غزا هوازن وثقيفا بالطائف. He says وحاصرهم في شوال وبعض ذي القعدة. So the Prophet ﷺ, so he fought actually Hawazin and also Thaqif in Ta'if, and he surrounded them in the month of Shawwal and also in part of Dhul Qa'dah. Right? So in part of Dhul Qa'dah. So Dhul Qa'dah is a time when you're not supposed to. Right? So that's the idea here. That's the dalil that they're referring to. He says, وقال آخرون, and others said, إنه غير منسوخ, that it's not abrogated. قال ابن جريج, حلف بالله عطاء ibn Abi Rabah, and also one of the mashayikh, the teachers of Imam Abu Hanifa. He says, ما يحل للناس أن يغزوا في الحرم وفي الأشهر الحرم إلا أن يقاتلوا فيها وما نسخت كذا في المعالم. So he mentions that what did Ibn Jurayj say? That he said that Ata swore an oath now that it's impermissible for people to fight in the haram and also in the sacred months. He says except if they are fought, and he says and it wasn't abrogated. He says كذا في المعالم, the معالم of course being the tafsir of Imam Baghawi, right? The معالم التنزيل, I think he mentions, yeah, also he mentions it here. معالم التنزيل. So this is كذا في المعالم, right? So this is like a general point that he makes, and he found that to be like a nice overview. That's why he used it here. And then he mentions وذكر صاحب المدارك من علمائنا أن عندنا يقاتلون في الأشهر الحرم لا في الحرم إلا أن يبدأوا بالقتال. So this is an important point now, because you can see how he resorted to a generic kind of tafsir. Remember Baghawi's work, generally the ulama would write commentaries on it. Hanafis have commentaries on it. It was popular on Ottoman lands. His tafsir was also quite popular as well. But it was a kind of like a general work. So you find it also in Ottoman curricula and the like, and that's absolutely fine. But you can see how Mulla Ali al-Qari does this thing where he then transitions to, you want clarity now on the Hanafi positions. What does he do? He goes to the Hanafi tafsir, right? He goes to Madarik al-Tanzil. He goes to Hafidhuddin Nasafi, who's 300 years prior to him, right? 300 years prior to him. A noted great scholar of usul and fiqh and tafsir and aqida, right? Well-known scholar, Mubarak scholar, wrote one of the greatest works of fiqh, the Kanz al-Daqa'iq, right? So this important shift now, you see, وذكر, and look how he phrased it as well, من علمائنا, right? From our scholars, i.e., this is what my forefathers said, right? Because what happens is when you're connected in these chains now, all of these people is ulama of the madhab, they become your forefathers in ilm, right? Just like you have forefathers in nasab, in lineage, like your parents and your grandparents and great grandparents and so on and so forth. These people now are from your forefathers, right? So he says that no, he says that you fight now. He says fil ashhuril hurum. He said in the sacred months. He says yet not in the haram, except if you're fought in the haram, right? Except if they start that. Otherwise, the haram is also considered to be an inviolable place. That's a separate issue, though, right? Because right now he's talking about the idea of ashurul hurum. So he says معناه نقاتلهم وإن كان ظاهر قوله تعالى واقتلوهم حيث ثقفتموهم يبيح القتل في الأمكنة كلها. So he says, so we fight them even though the outward purport of the verse and and fight them wherever you find them, right? As it were. He says indicates, like the zahir of this verse now indicates that it's actually permitted to kill them anywhere, right? So he just said not in the haram, right? So he says لقوله تعالى, so what's the reason for this? He says ولا تقاتلوهم عند المسجد الحرام حتى يقاتلوكم فيه. So don't now fight them, don't engage in this عند المسجد الحرام حتى يقاتلوكم فيه, which is what he just said, that if they begin fighting in this place, then you can fight at that point, but you don't actively begin yourself within the haram because it's a sacred space. So he says خص الحرم إلا عند البداية منه, which is just what we just seen. كذا في شرح التأويلات. Yeah. Uh, so Ta'wilat is another important book. He says the sharh of the Ta'wilat. Uh, This is by Abu al-Mu'in al-Nasafi. I probably have to double check that, but Abu al-Mu'in al-Nasafi. Right, so Abu al-Mu'in al-Nasafi is a 6th century reviver of like the Maturidi kind of madhab. And he's also the Sheikh of Najmuddin Nasafi, who is the famous author of it's odd that his book is more well known, but it's taught in madaris and institutions and worldwide, but it's al-Qa'id Nasafiyya. So if you ever heard of the book in Kalam and Aqida, Sharh al-Aqa'id, so the author of the Aqa'id is a Hanafi, right? As is Taftazani. At least we can do a Hanafi interpretation of him. I do actually have his Fatawa al-Hanafiyya, which is Taftazani's book on it's a Hanafi primer. It's like a Hanafi book, Hanafi fiqh, right? So this is like a pretty strong proof, like that. Anyway, we'll see if a Shafi'i book ever shows up, and I doubt it. But anyway, so we're claiming Taftazani for the time being. But the Aqa'id Nasafi and Najmuddin Nasafi, so he's a great scholar, 6th century as well. So his sheikh is Abu al-Mu'in al-Nasafi, who's a great reviver of the Maturidi school. That's why he has the magnum opus, as it were, in terms of like learning Maturidi Kalam, which is Tabsiratul Adilla. So he had a number of other books as well, and the Sharh of the Ta'wilat is one of them. But like I said, I have to double check that. Um, Otherwise, I did actually check the ta'wilat of, but that's not called the sharh of the ta'wilat, but the ta'wilat and sunnah of Imam Maturidi just on this particular verse, and he does mention exactly the same thing with respect to the interpretation of the verse. So again, you can see how another important general manhaj point that you can see how these Hanafis all operate in a certain way as well, right? So with respect to what's the verse mean, it just means this, right? And this is the Hanafi answer to the question, right? So and this is pretty much how they were. So you can see Sahib al-Madarik also saying the same thing. You can see Imam Maturidi saying the same thing, even on the. But of course, sometimes when they're expressing, they might actually, express that there's multiple positions on something. But then they'll do like ikhtiyar, right? So they actually whatever they express now is often going to be representative. Of course, it might sometimes be a personal ikhtiyar as well, personal choice, but often it is representative of the Hanafi position. So even on the previous point, Abu Layth al-Samarqandi in his Bahr al-Ulum, in his tafsir, which is also published, he mentions like a similar type of discussion, and he mentions explicitly that the first position, like, is the sounder position, and that of course is the Hanafi position on the issue. Okay, everybody still with us? All good? Following? Any questions? Okay. Okay, so next issue now. What's the next issue? He says, Dua Dukhul Rajab. So the dua now for the entrance of the month of Rajab. So he says, وقد روى البيهقي وابن عساكر وابن النجار عن أنس سيدنا أنس رضي الله تعالى عنه قال كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا دخل رجب قال اللهم بارك لنا في رجب وشعبان وبلغنا رمضان. Yeah. So this is just, again, it's just a separate point now where there's a dua now for the entrance of the month of Rajab. Like there's a dua where it's reported that the Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam used to recite this supplication, or he would recite the supplication. And of course, naturally, there's kalam with respect to many of the hadiths that will come up. I'll talk about that actually very very shortly. But at the end of the day, as we'll see later as well, even weaker hadiths, it's possible to to kind of act, particularly with something like a dua, and there's not a precedent for that as well. Um, and that's why the ulama will mention this dua, for example, as one of the things that can happen in the month of Rajab. Okay, then he says, Mana Rajab, where Asma'u. So the meaning of Rajab now, and also its names. So he says, وَعْلَمْ أَنَّ رَجَبًا منصرف عند الأكثر وهو الأظهر لاشتقاقه من رجب فلانا أي هبه وعظمه لتعظيم العرب إياه ولذا قال رجب المرجب أو رجب المرجب. So he says, realize then that Rajab is considered to be munsarif, i.e., that it's not that it can take like the tanween, for example, which is a technical grammar issue. So he says, and this is soundest position, because he says it's taken from اشتقاقه من رجب, i.e., because this is where it comes from, and this means هبه وعظمه, right? That he gave it to, venerated it, or um, give it reverence. Right? He says لتعظيم العرب إياه, as we talked about earlier, because the Arabs deemed it to be of great importance, and they had a lot of respect and reverence for this month. He says ولذا يقال رجب المرجب, أي Rajab, that which is venerated, right? That which is venerated. It says ويقال رجب رجب الأصم. So al-Asam. What's Asam? Asam is um, deaf, right? Deaf. He says لأنه لا ينادى فيه يا قوما ويا صباحا. So of course they would call it that because they would say that, for example, that you wouldn't be able to hear the sound of any weapons. Actually, sorry, he actually says this. أو لأنه لا يسمع فيه حس السلاح. I like the sound, like almost like the distant sound of weapons and the like. He says لا في الصباح ولا في الرواح. He says not in morning times, not in evening times. Why? Because people put their weapons down in the month of Rajab because it was a tremendous month, right? So this is the idea. Ya qawma wa ya sabaha. These were light battle cries, as it were, but it's not a battle cry rather, but it's the kind of thing that people would say when they wanted to um, uh, maybe go on a raid or something, right? So and oftentimes that would happen in the morning time, so that's why they would say sabaha, right? Ya sabaha, this being the cry for almost like heading out for like the raid. So he says, so you wouldn't hear that. Why? Because nobody's using their weapons at this time. That's the idea. He says وقد روى البيهقي عن عائشة رضي الله تعالى عنها قال وقال رفعه منكر. I Bayhaqi said that it's that Sayyidah Aisha said this, and it's not from the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. It says, "Inna Rajaban shahrullah, ويدعى الأصم, وكان أهل الجاهلية إذا دخل رجب يعطلون أسلحتهم ويضعونها فكان الناس يأمنون وتأمن السبل ولا يخافون بعضهم بعضا حتى ينقضي." So Rajab is from the month of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is called the almost like the silent, or and this is what the deafness here refers to, right? So it's almost like the silent month. He says, and the Jahili Arabs, the pre-Islamic Arabs, he says once the Rajab entered, then they would put their weapons down, right? And people were safe, right? And the pathways were safe, and nobody feared anybody else until the month had finished. Like nobody's gonna do anything in the month of Rajab. That was the idea. says وأما ما اشتهر من رجب الأصب وأن معناه تصب فيه الرحمة. right? تصب فيه الرحمة وتكب فيه النعمة فما رأيته في كتب اللغة. I mean that as for what's famous, that it's Rajab al-Asab, i.e. that its meaning is that it's almost like I guess you could say the Rajab, which is like filled. So he says in the sense that there's Rahma which is poured into it, and it's kind of like tipping over with blessings and the like. He says that I've not seen this in the books of language. Again, if you want to say something, right, then it has to have some type of asl. Right, so what's the asl when it comes to these types of things? Then you would return back to the books of Lugha, which would give clarity on them. So he says, وذكر أبو الفتح ابن أبي الفرداء يا أبي الفوارس في أماليه عن الحسن مرسلا رجب شهر الله وشعبان شهري ورمضان شهر أمتي. أي Rajab is the month of Allah, Sha'ban is my month, Ramadan is the month of my own. Okay. هل ثبت في فضل صيامه حديث? Right, so is there any sound hadith with respect to the merit of the month of sorry, the merit yeah, let me say that again. في فضل صيامه, right, hadith. So is there any sound report on the merit of fasting in the month of Rajab? Right, so this is the next section now. This is the next thing that he wants to talk about. He says وجاء في فضائل صومه أحاديث ضعيفة. So you can see how he says now that with respect to, for academic honesty, you can see there's a number of weak hadith which have been transmitted with respect to the merit of fasting in the month of Rajab. He says تصير بكثرة طرقها مع أن الحديث تصير قوية بكثرة طرقها قوية مع أن الأحاديث الضعيفة الأحوال excuse me معتبرة في فضائل الأعمال يعني تفيد. So he says that these are weak hadiths, but he says, but if you gather the various turuq, the various versions of them and the like, then he says they gain some strength, right? They gain strength. He says, but whilst also being cognizant of the fact that weaker hadiths are still considered with respect to meritorious actions, right? Virtuous actions. He says, yani tufid, i.e. that there's still a benefit which is manifesting with respect to that. Now, of course, he's going to mention now how many hadiths? Yeah, so he's going to mention about 6 or 7 hadiths now. But of course, many of them, apart from perhaps the one that we'll see in just a moment, but many of them have issues, of course. This is why Ibn Amir al-Mu'minin fil Hadith, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, right? So what does he actually say? He actually has a whole book on the Hadith on Rajab. It's called Tabyin al-Ajab. Right? So he actually has a whole book, and he actually mentions yeah, he says أما الأحاديث الواردة في فضل رجب أو صيامه, so on the merit of the month of Rajab in and of itself, or on fasting, right? The in Rajab, he says أو صيام شيء منه, or fasting something of the month of Rajab. He says فهي على قسمين. He says they are of 2 types. He says ضعيفة وموضوعة. He says weak and fabricated, right? So weak and fabricated. So these are the 2 types. So this is Ibn Hajar. Ibn Hajar, remember, is Amir al-Mu'minin fil Hadith. right? So what does he say? He says some of them are weak, some of them are fabricated. Of course, naturally, we already know. Um, I don't think he's going to mention it explicitly, actually. Uh, yeah, I don't think he's going to mention it explicitly. But we already know that with respect to weak hadiths, then the ulama, um, as long as it had some type of asl in the Sharia. So, for example, fast, right, or pray, or something like that, like something which has an asl in the Sharia, some basis in the Sharia, and it was not extremely weak. I mean, weakness wasn't, excessive, and also it wasn't deemed to be a sunnah. As long as these three conditions were met, then the ulama deemed it to be acceptable to act in accordance with such hadiths, right? So there's some type of merit, and that's why, for example, even the great hadith scholars like Imam Bukhari, for example, he has a whole book, his Adab al-Mufrad, right, which is distinct from his Jami' al-Sahih, right, his Sahih, and has all kind of weak hadiths in it. Right, there's all kind of weak hadiths in it, and many of the ulama have books like this. So a weak hadith is not a hadith which has no manner, has no purpose. Rather, we just cannot affirm now with certainty that these are the words of the Prophet ﷺ, right? But it's clearly not a fabrication, right? Because a fabrication means that it's completely made up, so there's no chance that the Prophet ﷺ actually said this. But when it's weak, then there's still a chance that the Prophet ﷺ said this, but we just don't have certainty, obviously, and we don't have reasonable surety with respect to that either, right? So it just remains like a chance. And then because the da'if, a weak hadith, is of multiple levels, then it's almost like there are some legitimate levels and some illegitimate levels. So the idea is that when it was excessively weak, this is when they didn't really like it. But when it was like just generally weak, then they still affirmed that this still has some type of benefit. And that's why Mulla Ali al-Qari over here, right? That's why he says over here, Yani tufid, right? That it's like they are weak, but he's saying that if you gather their turuq, then they are affirming something, right? But the idea is that even some of the ones that he actually brings here, I think Ibn Hajar, some of them certainly he might include them in his manakir. I haven't checked, but if anybody's interested, they can go and compare, and they can go and check. Um, but I will point out the hadith which Ibn Hajar said has a basis. Like it's not possible to say it's fabrication. That it's a weak hadith, but it's there. And this is important, and we'll see why shortly. Now, of course, I'm using Ibn Hajar here because this is now somebody who is well known for hadith and the like, and he has a whole book on this, right? So even if you have problems with respect to Mulla Ali al-Qari and even the statements over here, then that's why I'm also referencing Ibn Hajar to kind of show that look, there's hadith scholars who went through these hadiths as well and deemed some of them to be acceptable and others to be illegitimate, right? So of course, um, you know, it's not permissible to transmit fabrications, right? And it's also part of ilmi adab and consistency and the proper manner for talib al-ilm, that if you're quoting a hadith, for example, you go back to the original source, right? So you don't necessarily quote from somewhere else. So if something a fiqh issue, you'd go back to the fuqaha and see what they said in those books, right? So if it's an usuli issue, go back to the books of usul. If it's aqida issue, go back to the books of aqida and kalam and so on. And similarly, if it's a hadith, then it's good practice to go back to the original source and to quote it right from that point. Of course, lots of these hadiths, there's a lot of kalam about them, right? So that's why Ibn Hajar, even though he said that they're of two types, most of the ones he actually lists are fabrications, right? So even though Mullah Ali al-Qari over here is kind of indicating that they're weak, and and because there's a lot of turuq and the like, other scholars would probably disagree with this. Having said that, there's still this idea that at least one key hadith that he mentions here Ibn Hajar does affirm that it's weak, but it's not fabricated. So anyway, and this is why I said that this is important. Later we'll come back to this, because this statement then becomes important because now we do actually have hadiths then which indicate some type of fadl. And to be honest, even if you forget that for even if you put that to one side, Ibn Hajar himself in his book, before he gets into the details, because he affirms from the beginning, from the get-go, that there's no sahih hadith, there's nothing which can be considered an adequate hujjah, which shows any merit, right, of to fasting in the month of Rajab. But he does himself um, mention a hadith, which you can check in the Tabyin al-Ajab, but I'm just going to quote the sentence that he says, which is important. He says, ذلك شهر يغفل الناس. Sorry, this is the hadith actually. Sorry, I didn't realize. But he says, ذلك شهر يغفل الناس عنه بين رجب ورمضان. Al-Hadith. So this is the hadith of the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام. I believe it's in Nasa'i. So it's in Nasa'i. So as I'm talking to you, I'm writing it down in my own book. So it's in Nasa'i. And he says فهذا فيه إشعار. This is Ibn Hajar. إشعار بأن في رجب مشابهة برمضان. Right? So there's some kind of resemblance of Rajab to Ramadan. He says بأن في رجب he says برمضان. He says وأن الناس يشتغلون من العبادة بما يشتغلون به في رمضان. Right? In the sense that people would engage in ibadah in the month of Rajab just like they would engage in ibadah in the month of Ramadan. That's Ibn Hajar's take on that hadith, which he's using to begin his work on the merits of, the month of Rajab, right? So indicating thereby that there's a merit, right? That's what he's trying to kind of show, and then also there's hadiths, these weaker hadiths on it. So you can see if you kind of put all this stuff together, there's something there. There's definitely something there, right? So you can't just simply turn around and say, fabrication, just put it all on the side and there's no merit, just like any other day in any other month, right? So clearly there's some type of merit, and the ulama are all expressing this, whether it be the hadith scholars, right? Like Ibn Hajar, Amir al-Mu'mineen for the hadith, it's not like just a random scholar, like they're talking about one of the great muhaqqiqeen, right? And his kalam in terms of jarh wa ta'deel in his books, and his musalahat and his standards, and and it's his book on the month of Rajab as well. So it's like so that's very strong. And Mulla Ali al-Qari, of course, over here, our author right now, is also saying something similar. Anyway, that was all just an introduction now. So now I'm going to read the hadiths, and I'm not necessarily going to translate everything, but inshallah you'll get a sense of it now. So he says, أن رجب شهر عظيم تضاعف فيه الحسنات من صام يوم منه كان كصيام سنة, which is the important part here, that whoever fasts a single day, then it's as if he has fasted the entire year, right? So رواه الرافعي وعن ابن عباس رضي الله تعالى عنهما مرفوعا صوم أول يوم من رجب كفارة 3 سنين. Right, fasting the first day of Rajab is like an expiation for 3 years. والثاني كفارة سنتين والثالث كفارة سنة. He says ثم كل يوم شهر. Right, so the second day is like 2 years expiation, and the third, in terms of the thawab, right? That's not in terms of like an actual expiation. Like somebody has to do expiation for the month of Ramadan. You can't just fast like on this day based on this hadith. And this hadith is not even thabit anyway. Right? There's a lot of discussion about it. I don't want to affirm that it's thabit or not thabit. I'll leave that to the muhaddithin. But he says أخرجه أبو محمد الخلال في فضائل رجب وعن أنس رضي الله تعالى عنه مرفوعا. So this is actually the hadith where Ibn Hajar actually lists in his selection of hadiths, which he said this one is weak, right? So he says non-fabrication. He said this is a weak hadith. So remember, he said that they are of two types. They are weak. We didn't clarify that, or excessively weak or anything. It just says they are weak and they are fabrications, right? So and that's why he has his initial discussion as well. So anyway, what does it say? It says إن في الجنة نهر يقال له رجب. Right? So there's a river in paradise which is called Rajab. He says ماؤه أشد بياضا من اللبن وأحلى من العسل. He says من صام يوما من رجب سقاه الله من ذلك النهر. This is the fadila which he mentions here, that whoever fasts now in the month of Rajab, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will allow him to drink from this river. He says رواه البيهقي والشيرازي في الألقاب. uh, yeah, Ibn Hajar just says في الإسلام ضعيف في الجملة. Right? It's just generally, he just says it's generally considered to be weak. Right? Just generally speaking, it's weak. Right? So he doesn't like go into like specifics and the details. I mean, he does talk about it, but anyway, that's like his khulasa. But that's an important statement. That's why I'm mentioning it. And then I'll just read the other hadith that he has here. وعن ابن عمر رضي الله تعالى عنهما مرفوعا من صام أول يوم من رجب عدل ذلك في الصيام سنة. Again, this idea of whoever fasts a single day of Ramadan, it equates to entire fasting. ومن صام 7 أيام أغلق عنه 7 أبواب أو أغلق عنه 7 أبواب النار. ومن صام من رجب 10 أيام نادى مناد في السماء أن سل تعطوا. That whoever fasts now 10 days, then a caller will call out from the sky that ask and you shall receive it. Yes, ask whatever you want, and you'll receive it. أخرجه ابن نعيم وابن عساكر وعن أبي ذر رضي الله تعالى عنه مرفوعا من صام يوما من رجب عدل صيامه شهرا ومن صام منه أي. So again, if you fast a single day, then it equates to a month. ومن صام منه 7 أيام غلقت عنه أبواب الجحيم السبعة. Right, so his 7 doors of the nar are closed. ومن صام منه 8 أيام فتحت له أبواب الجنة الثمانية. ومن صام منه 10 أيام 10 أيام بدلت سيئاته حسنات. So if you fast 10 days, then your evil deeds are transformed into good deeds. Right? Of course, it's a Quranic reality. Right? That this idea of tabdil سيئات حسنات, and some of the awliya, they also have this dua. No, actually, that's a different type of dua. Yeah. Anyway, he says ومنه he says ومن صام منه 18 يوما نادى مناد أن الله قد غفر لك ما مضى فاستأنف العمل. Right, so if it's very specific here, you can see it's 18 days. Then somebody calls from the caller from the sky that that God has forgiven you what's past. So carry on from this point. رواه الخطيب. You start afresh as it were. وعن أنس مرفوعا من صام يوم من رجب كان كصيام سنة. ومن صام 7 أيام غلقت عنه 7 أبواب جهنم. ومن صام 8 أيام فتحت له 8 أبواب الجنة. ومن صام 10 أيام لم يسأل الله شيئا إلا أعطاه. 10 days, then he won't ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala anything except that he will receive it. ومن صام 15 يوما نادى مناد من السماء قد غفرت لك ما سلف فاستأنف العمل قد بدلت سيئاتك حسنات. Right, again, same type of manner. It says وفي رجب حمل نوح عليه السلام في السفينة فصام نوح وأمر من معه أن يصوموا وجرت بهم السفينة 6 أشهر إلى آخر ذلك ل10 خلون من المحرم. ورواه الطبراني عن سعيد بن أبي راشد مرفوعا. uh, yeah, okay. Seems that the next one, yeah. So this one was it just says عن أنس مرفوعا. Actually, sorry, he says in the footnote that he says أخرجه البيهقي في الشعب. Right? So he mentions that Bayhaqi actually for this hadith. So he says رواه الطبراني عن سعيد بن راشد مرفوعا as well. And that's رجب شهر عظيم يضاعف الله فيه الحسنات فمن صام يوم من رجب فكأنما صام سنة. Again, same thing. If you fast a day, so as if you fasted the whole month. The whole year, sorry. ومن صام منه 7 أيام غلقت عنه 7 أبواب جهنم. ومن صام منه 8 أيام فتحت له 8 أبواب الجنة. ومن صام منه 10 أيام لم يسأل الله شيئا إلا أعطاه إياه. ومن صام منه 15 يوما نادى منادي من السماء قد غفر الله لك ما مضى فاستأنف العمل ومن زاد زاده الله. وفي رجب حمل الله نوحا في السفينة فصام رجبا. Right, so he's carried in the ship, so he fasted the month of Rajab. وأمر من معه أن يصوموا. And he also commanded those who were with him to also fast. فجرت بهم السفينة 6 أشهر. آخر ذلك يوم عاشوراء هبط على الجودي فصام نوح ومن معه ومعه قومه والوحش شكرا لله عز وجل. Right, so I'm not sure how that happened, but you can see here how it settles on the Mount Judy, and he says, and Sayyidina Nuh, he fasted, ومعه قومه. So either the people fasted, and also he says والوحش, also the animals fasted too. Right, so I'm not sure how that happened, but شكرا لله تعالى. Um, Unless you want to say that his people and the animals were with him. But it seems like he's trying to say that they found, I'm not sure what that means. But anyway, maybe there was some manifestation of some karamat for him. And anyway, it's irrelevant. This hadith, there's so much kalam on it anyway, right? So it doesn't really matter. So من يوم في يوم عاشوراء فلق الله البحر لبني إسرائيل. So also on the day of Ashura, the أي المحرم, right? So he says, so the sea was split. وفي يوم عاشوراء تاب الله على آدم وعلى أهل مدينة يونس, right? So the city of Sayyidina Yunus and also Sayyidina Adam. وفيه ولد إبراهيم. وروى البيهقي وقال منكر عن سلمان الفارسي مرفوعا. Yeah, so indicating again that's not really transmitted. It's not really sound. So في رجب يوم وليلة ومن صام ذلك اليوم وقام تلك الليلة كان كمن صام الدهر 100 سنة وقام 100 سنة وهو لثلاث بقين من رجب وفيه بعث الله تعالى محمدا. وعن أنس أيضا مرفوعا من صام 3 أيام من شهر حرام الخميس والجمعة والسبت كتب له عبادة سنتين. So whoever fasts 3 days from a inviolable month, i.e. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, he says then he has the ibadah of 2 years. رواه الطبراني في الأوسط. Right. وعنه أيضا. So you can see how, look, Tabrani, the Awsat, it's not like these are just like in some obscure kind of books, right? Bayhaqi is transmitting them, Tabarani is transmitting these hadiths. Like these hadiths are like, they're there. Of course, just because Tabarani has it, or Abu Nu'aym mentions the other one as well. The idea is that just, of course, it doesn't mean that just because Bayhaqi mentioned or Tabarani mentioned that it's Sahih Hadith or it's an Hadith or anything like that. But the idea is that it's not like everything is in like in some obscure thing. It's like it still made it to these significant kind of collections. These famous scholars still included these hadiths in their collections for various reasons. And finally, وعنه أيضا من صام في كل شهر حرام الخميس والجمعة والسبت كتبت له عبادة 700 سنة أخرجه ابن شاهين في ترغيبه وابن عساكر. Okay, النهي عن صيامه ومعناه. So what about the prohibition against fasting? So these are all hadiths now, which about the merit of fasting, and then we talked about we had this introductory discussion and everything. The point, the khulasa of all of this, excuse me, is, as I mentioned, that we've affirmed some type of reality that there's some merit that Ibn Hajar is also alluding to, Mulla Ali al-Qari is alluding to something, that even if there's no sound hadith, there are other hadiths which would appear to indicate something, and there's weak hadiths here, so that it's not completely baseless, right? It's not a complete like fabrication or something. And if somebody were to do something more now, i.e. on the basis that there's some type of falila, is this a problem now? This is the discussion where, and the context of some of the matters which will show up now as well. So first of all, before getting to that, he just mentions a brief point on what about the apparent prohibition against fasting in this month. Right? So against fasting in this month. So he says, وأما ما رواه ابن ماجه أنه عليه السلام نهى عن صيام رجب, that he prohibited fasting in the month of Rajab. He says فمحمول على اعتقاد وجوبه كما في الجاهلية. Right. So how do you interpret this? So it's interpreted in such that the person imagines that it's wajib to do so. Right. He says like in the pre-Islamic times. Right. So it's only that i'tiqad which makes it prohibited. So in the absence of that, it's not. That's what he's saying. In the absence of that, it's not considered to be problematic. And then he says al-istighfar fi shahri Rajab. So now seeking forgiveness in the month of Rajab. So he's going one by one through the various issues which the ulama have talked about. Okay, how's everyone doing? Everyone with me? All good? Following? Making sense? Any questions? How's it going so far? Um, Following all good. Yeah, alhamdulillah, enlightening. Okay, great. Good stuff. Uh, yeah, so conclusion on fasting Rajab is that it's good based on weak evidences. It's not quite what I said, but the idea is that he's going to mention like a number of other meritorious acts. So the point which the khulasa of everything that we had kind of come to was that there appears to be some type of merit, right? That Ibn Hajar is kind of alluding to, that Mulla Ali al-Qari is kind of alluding to. But of course, there's no Sahih hadith about anything. And so even Ibn Hajar, what I mentioned earlier, when the comment that I was mentioning, this is an illusion, right? That he's taking this from some other hadith, right? Indicating that there's some type of fa'idah which is present there. And also indicating that there's, when he indicates that there's two types of hadiths, like some are weak and some are fabricated. Um, and so the idea is that there's a general sense of uh, of like it's not exactly the same as everything else. Right? It's not exactly the same as like all the other days and months and years and so on. Even if there's nothing which is sahih, right? There is something, there are other things which have i'tibar with respect to fada'ilul a'mal, right? So nobody is like, it's not a sunnah, it's like you can't say it with absolute conviction, as it were. That's not the point. But the idea is that if somebody now acts on account of all of this, right? Recognizing that there's some fadila. Qatada, remember he talked about the Ashhur al-Hurum and how doing good deeds like has a greater thawab, right? So you can see some of the ulama saying this as well. Sorry, is there any sound, is sound coming through? Okay, it's fine. Okay, okay, that's fine. Um, yeah, the month is meritorious, but no specific acts have been transmitted with definitiveness. That's a separate point. We actually didn't get to any acts yet. All right, so that's coming. So right now, all we talked about was the idea of the fast. Like initially, just about the merit of the month itself, and then specifically about fasting. Right. So is there something about fasting? So so this was the point of this whole section. But as I mentioned, one of those cases was the idea of um, the fact that not all of not all of the hadith, all the hadith will naturally have kalam on them, but the idea is that are they all fabrications? Right? So that's not the case, right? So are there some weak hadiths there? Yes, right. So even by Ibn Hajar's own admission, it's not like he's he's down. I mean, that's his own conclusion, right? That so the idea is that what's the nature of it as well, right? So how do we, because it's not just this one hadith, as it were, which establishes some type of, but the idea is that you have different things and different indications, right? Different indications that there's some type of merit which can be used for fadailul amal, right? That's the point that Mulla Ali al-Qari was making. It's also the point which is kind of being alluded to by Ibn Hajar, right? So, but in a general sense, it's not like a specific hadith, as it were. It's like you put all of these things together, and you can see how there's something there, right? There's something there, even though it might not necessarily be at the level of um, strong enough to be like a complete hujjah. Uh, did you cover the Sahih Muslim hadith? Um, no, he didn't mention this hadith. He didn't mention this hadith. We'd have to check it. Um, are this hadith with respect to sacred months in general, not specific to Rajab? We'd have to check if there's anything because this, of course, today's discussion is all just about Rajab. Right, so though it began, but that was just situating Rajab in the months of in the sacred and inviolable months. That even from that, you recognize that there's something different about Rajab. It's not the same. right? Ashhur al-Hurum are not the same as the rest of the months, right? There's something already special about them, right? So it's just now something beyond that, right? Is it possible to affirm that there's something, some type of fadila? That's what we're talking about as well. So based on Mulla Ali al-Qari, based on what these ulama are kind of indicating now, there's something, right? There's something, right? And of course, I want us to consider this from a fiqh perspective, not a hadith perspective, right? And that's why I'm framing it in the way that I'm framing it, right? Because we're not being trying to be muhaddithin here, right? So in terms of, because if we're talking about actual practice, because that's the nature of everything else that he's going to mention now as well, then of course you have to have your fiqh hat on, right? Not a hadith hat. I'm just showing you from a hadith perspective, like Ibn Hajar, to show you that even the muhaddithin types, even the Amir al-Mu'minin fil hadith, right? So even they are affirming that there's some type of fadila. They're talking about isharat of certain hadiths. They're affirming that not all the hadiths are like made up and fabricated and stuff. There are some weak hadiths about the merit of fasting and the like in the month of Rajab. So I'm saying that that's all that perspective, but now we have to contextualize it from a fiqh perspective, right? Okay. So let's do istighfar now. So he says, وعن علي رضي الله تعالى عنه مرفوعا أكثروا من الاستغفار في شهر رجب فإن لله في كل ساعة منه عتقاء من النار. He says كذا في الذيل وفي إسناده متروك. He says وقد سمعت بعض المشايخ something, there's probably something missing here, أن يستغفر في هذا الشهر كثيرا ويقول أستغفر الله ذا الجلال والإكرام من جميع الذنوب والآثام. من جميع الذنوب والآثام. So he says, so he says, do a lot of istighfar in the month of Rajab, because in every moment Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala frees people from the hellfire in it. So he says, and he says here, if he is matruk, i.e. somebody who's matruk al-hadith, i.e. somebody whose hadith is not considered to be accepted, right? i.e. indicating that there's a lot of, considerable weakness in the hadith. But again, not necessarily affirming that it's a fabrication, right? He says وقد سمعت بعض المشايخ, right? So now he's coming at it from a separate angle, right? So he says that some of the ulama, they would seek forgiveness, he says, in this month a lot. He says, and say أستغفر الله ذا الجلال والإكرام من جميع الذنوب والآثام. He says ثم رأيت المنوفي قال مالكي قال, he says وقد أفاد صاحب ترغيب المطالب في أشرف المطالب أنه رأى بخط الحافظ كمال الدين الدميري. الدميري is again, he is a Shafi'i, but he's also the owner, he's the author of this what's it called, Hayat what's it called, الحيوان الكبرى. Yeah, حياة الحيوان الكبرى. So it's like this compendium of like animals, definitions of them and the like, and he has like some Shafi'i fiqh and stuff as well. He says عن ابن عباس رضي الله عنهما مرفوعا. He says من قال في شهر رجب وشعبان. So شهر رجب وشعبان. So he says أستغفر الله العظيم الذي لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم وأتوب إليه توبة عبد ظالم لنفسه لا يملك لنفسه موتا ولا حياة ولا نشورا 7 مرات. So if he says this 7 times, this dua, أوحى الله تعالى إلى ملكين الموكلين به أن خرقا صحيفة ذنوبه. Right, so it's inspired to his 2 angels, right, to burn, right, his book of bad deeds, right, his book of bad deeds. He says وقال ويكفينا في ثبوت وروده اعتناء حافظ الضمير بنقله بخطه. Right, so this is ساكتا عليه. So again, you see Mulla Ali al-Qari indicating that this is this also has i'tibar, right? He says, how so? It suffices that this is established given the fact that Hafiz al-Damiri, who's like a known faqih and scholar and alim, he says he wrote this with his own hand and he didn't comment on it. ساكتا عليه ولو كان موضوعا لبينه, and if it was fabricated he would have explained this. فإنه إمام في هذا الفن, because it is iman in this. وَأَقَلُّ مَرَاتِبِهِ أَنْ يَكُونَ ضَعِيفًا. And the least of it states, right, i.e. of this hadith, it's ضعيف. And again, he emphasizes the same thing. You can see, وَالضَّعِيفُ يُعْمَلُ بِهِ فِي فَضَائِلِ الْأَعْمَالِ اتِّفَاقًا. Right, indicating the same idea. Again, this idea is, as we talked about, the ulama, it's not just Mulla Ali al-Qari who says this, right? It's not like something particular to Mulla Ali al-Qari. That's why I mentioned it before. There's something agreed upon by the ulama. Right? They agree upon this reality, and that's why you can find it. You find it everywhere, right? So, Sakhawi, for example, mentions it, and others, everybody, like who doesn't mention it, right? There's everybody's mentioning it, and they always point to the fact that there's the early righteous and the early Muslims and the early muhaddithin are actually mentioning, they have these books like Bukhari's Adab al-Mufrad, for example. These types of books which contain weak hadiths, and they didn't really see a problem with it, right? As it didn't directly relate to the halal and haram like a direct hukum as such, but it's about meritorious actions, and as long as they fall under some type of asl, and the person doesn't deem it to be a specific sunnah, then they didn't find anything problematic, right? Again, from a fiqh perspective, there's not anything problematic with it, right? As long as you don't deem it to be a sunnah, right? And there's some fadila, some merit which is established, and somebody does it, and it's something which is falls under general asl in the Sharia, like it's prayer or fasting or charity, whatever. Somebody does it seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala therein. So they act on that thing which is transmitted. Worst case scenario, right? Absolute worst case scenario, right? Has he done something haram? No, absolutely not. Right? He hasn't done anything haram. He actually done something praiseworthy, like he prayed or he fasted or whatever. So, worst case scenario, he did it because he heard about some type of thawab, right, which might manifest. And this thawab, it's like, let's just say for argument's sake, that's completely fabricated. Okay, so he did something, but he did it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the point. He never deemed it to be a sunnah, never deemed it to be part of the deen as such. But it's something that he had heard about and something which inspired him to practice. So he does it. So is this haram? Right? So the answer is no, it's not. And that person who actually does act in accordance with it, it's not problematic. Of course, the only thing which he didn't necessarily like. Of course, we can also, this is Mulla Ali al-Qari might be okay with this, but we can always argue about this. For example, we can always have a discussion about it. We don't necessarily have to follow Mulla Ali al-Qari with respect to this particular point. But again, remember that's why I kind of introduced Mulla Ali al-Qari as well, right? So you can appreciate who he is as well, right? So you can see so far he's quite an approval of these types of things, right? So far he's quite happy with things which are manifesting, and he finds like usul for them. So he's like, yeah, you want to do this istighfar, like go ahead, right? Like there's not well, like, what's wrong with doing it istighfar, right? Something which has been transmitted, even if it's fabricated, then what? Like, is there any bad words that you can see in this? Astaghfirullah al-azim, alladhi la ilaha illa wal hayy al-qayyum. Sounds similar to the other supplications that you probably make. وَأَتُوبُ إِلَيْهِ تَوْبَةَ عَبْدٍ ظَالِمٍ لِنَفْسِهِ. Somebody who's wronged himself. لا يملك لنفسه. He doesn't, unable to do anything with respect to himself, with his death or his life or his resurrection, right? And he says, like, it's just like it's an expression of faqr, it's an expression of dhikr, expression of forgiveness. Like, again, there's nothing here which is problematic, right? As well, في المختص رجب شهر الله, we saw this before, شعبان شهري ورمضان شهر أمتي. And this is one, I think, Ibn رواه الديلمي وغيره عن أنس, one of those which we saw earlier, but Ibn Hajar, for example, I think he might mention this in his موضوعات as one of the fabricated hadiths. وأما حديث خطب صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم قبل رجب بجمعة فقال: أيها الناس، قد أضلكم شهر عظيم، رجب شهر الله العصم، تضاعف فيه الحسنات وتستجاب فيه الدعوات ويفرج فيه عن الكروبات، فحديث منكر. And so he says, as for this hadith which is transmitted, which again some of the ulama mentioned, then he says that this is of no consequence, right? So it's Rasa'il hadith. He says شهر رجب له فضيلة بالنسبة إلى سائر الشهور. I forgot he was going to mention this. But so now he has the section on the month of Rajab, that it has a fadila, it has a virtue with respect to the remaining months. So he says وَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ يَتَحَصَّلْ مِنْ جَمِيعِ مَا ذُكِرْ. So he says, so realize now that based on everything which has been mentioned, أن شهر رجب له بعض فضيلة بالنسبة إلى سائر الشهور. Right, so even the way he frames it, look what he says. He says that it has something of a merit with respect to the remainder of the months. Like that's something that you can see. Right? He says فما يفعله الناس من إكثار الاعتماد فيه وكذا إخراج الزكاة من الدرهم والدينار وغير ذلك من أعمال الأبرار فلا شبهة في جواز ذلك ومزيد الأجر والثواب هنالك أو هناك. So he says, so as for that which people do of more umrahs, right? So if you're in Mecca, then of course you're going to be seeing that as he is. And he says also people paying their zakat from dirhams and dananir, and also he says, and other actions of the righteous. And he says then it's undoubtedly, he says that this is considered to be permissible. And he says that there's a greater thawab in this, even if, as we talked about just a few moments ago, even if you take away and see, I don't agree that there's any merit whatsoever because the hadiths are all too weak and fabricated and everything. Right? Even if you say this, is there not a greater thawab in doing more ibadah? Right? There is. So he's right, even objectively speaking. Right? So even if you take away this point about this, like is simply, but of course that's not. He's not speaking objectively. He's trying to affirm this point now based on everything that you've seen so far. He said there is بعض فضيلة. There's something of a merit, right? Something of a merit. So if people are acting on the basis that I have a greater thawab if I do something right now, he's saying that there's undoubtedly, he said that this is praiseworthy. He said this is absolutely fine. There's nothing problematic with this, as long as they don't deem it to be a sunnah, as long as they don't deem it to be part of religion as something soundly transmitted, and yeah. So he says, ولا معنى لنهي بعض العلماء على الصيام فيه. Right. So again, emphasizing something else. He says, وقوله إنه بدعة. And he says, so he said, there's no ma'na now to some of the ulama, or to one. He might be alluding to somebody, prohibiting fasting in the month of Rajab, i.e., with somebody who, after seeing those hadiths and so on and everything, decides that actually there's some fadila, some merit to fasting in this month. So they decide fast. So he said, there's no ma'na after everything you've seen for somebody to turn around and say this is a bid'ah. Right? To say this is a reprehensible innovation in the Sharia. Right? So reprehensible innovation in the Sharia. He says, فَالْمَطْلُوبُ مِنَ الْخَلْقِ الْعِبَادَةِ. He says, والعبادة وكثرة الطاعة على قدر الطاقة وبحسب الاستطاعة. So he says, so what sort? Yeah, bid'ah police always existed. Yeah. So there's always people, right? So he says, but this is ulama, look, like he's saying it's ulama. But he says, what sort from creation now in people is ibadah, right? And increasing acts of worship as much as one is reasonably able to do so. He says, وأجمع العلماء, again emphasizing the point, بجواز العمل بالأحاديث الضعيفة الواردة في فضائل الأعمال والله أعلم بحقيقة الأحوال. And again, emphasizing the point that the ulama have agreed unanimously that it's acceptable to act in accordance with weak hadith which are transmitted with respect to meritorious actions. He says, and Allah knows best, but he says, of course, this means in the context of, as we've mentioned, that you don't deem it to be a sunnah and it falls under an asl of the sharia. Something already exists. So, for example, it's in reference to fasting. Fasting is already part of the sharia, i.e., whoever fasts, for example, these types of hadiths, or you see that praying on a certain time, whatever. Again, the idea of prayer already exists in the sharia. But if it tells you to do something made up, like, of course, that wouldn't be transmitted anyway. But if there's the kind of thing that fast during the night, for example, so fast during the night instead of during the day, this would be a bid'ah. This wouldn't be acceptable to practice. Because this clearly contravenes established sunnah, right? Established usul in the sharia, right? So this is always how we consider these types of matters. So this finally brings us to Salatul Ghaib. I was supposed to have most of the discussion here, but it's getting late now. So might just press ahead and just to make it a shorter discussion. But let's see what happens. Okay, everybody still with us? Following questions, comments, all clear, all good? Good, bad? Yeah. Okay, good stuff. Okay, so let's look at the next issue now. Next issue, Salatul Ghaib. Yeah, alhamdulillah. So what does he say? وأما صلاة الرغائب. He says, what is it? وهي 12 ركعة. بعد المغرب في أول جمعة من رجب يصلي 12 ركعة ب6 تسليمات، يقرأ في كل ركعة بعد الفاتحة سورة القدر 3 والإخلاص 12، وبعد الفراغ يصلي على النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم 70 مرة ويدعو بما شاء، فرجال حديثها مجهولون، وصرح جماعة بأنهم موضوع. Right. So what happened now? So this is the Salatul Raghaib. So Salatul Raghaib is also transmitted down. So what is it? So he describes it as being 12 rak'ahs that you pray after Maghrib on the first Jum'ah in the month of Rajab. Right? First Jum'ah in the month of Rajab, you pray 12 rak'ahs. He says with sitta taslimat. So two, basically, two. Right? That's what he's saying. So he says يقرأ في كل ركعتين. So in each rak'ah, after the Fatiha, 3 times Surah Al-Qadr and 12 times Surah Al-Ikhlas in each rak'ah. And then he says, and after you've done, then you send blessings on the Prophet ﷺ 70 times, and then you make dua. So he says, so the narrators now of this are completely unknown transmitters. And he says, and a group of the ulama have deemed this to be a fabrication. Right? So this is what he says now. So then he says, وفي شرح مسلم للنووي. So Imam Nawawi says, احتج العلماء. So he's quoting Imam Nawawi now. احتج العلماء على كراهة صلاة الرغائب بحديث لا تخص ليلة الجمعة بقيام ولا تخص يوم الجمعة بصيام. So he says, so they deemed Salatul Raghaib to be makruh based on the fact that you're not supposed to specify the night of Jum'ah for prayer and also its day for fasting. So he says, فإنها, according to this hadith. So he says, فإنها بدعة, according to Nawawi, right? فإنها بدعة منكرة من بدع الضلالة والجهالة. Right? So he's emphasizing now this reprehensibility of this particular act. He says, وفيها منكرات ظاهرة. There are obvious manakir, which are manifest like wrongs, which manifest in this prayer. قاتل الله واضعها ومخترعها. Yeah, may Allah destroy the one who made this up. He says, وقد صنف الأئمة مصنفات نفيسة في تقبيحها. Right, so many of the ulama have written precious treatises explaining the ugliness now of this prayer. وتضليل مصليها ومبتدعيها. And showing the misguidance of the person who prays it, وَدَلَائِلِ قُبْحِهَا, and the reasons for why it's considered to be unsightly, right, i.e. wrong. وَبُطْلَانِهَا وَتَضَلُّلِ فَاعِلِهَا أَكْثَرُ مِنْ أَنْ تُحْصَرْ. And he said, and the reasons for this are too many to count. He said, انتهى كلامه. So what does he say? He says, وفيه, this is Mulla Ali al-Qari now. وفيه أن إطلاق الضلالة والجهالة على من يصلي ليلة الجمعة فرادى أو بالجماعة محل بحث. Right? He says, and saying now that the person who prays on the night, i.e. Thursday night, like the night of Friday, he says either alone in congregation is misguidance, right? And this is ignorance. He says this is a point, this is debatable, right? He said this is debatable. He said, لأن الصلاة خير موضوع. He says, because the prayer is the best of matters, right? As is transmitted, that's why. He says, ولو قيل في هذا الحديث إنه موضوع. He says, even if it said that this hadith is موضوع وعلى التسليم And if we submit to this fact, فَالْإِثْمُ عَلَى الْوَاضِعِ, that he said that the sin is on the person who fabricated it. لا حرج على من يعمل بالعمل الواقع فالواقع. He says, and there's no harm in the person who actually acts in accordance with this in reality. So this is really, you can see how he really doesn't, he's not very happy with Imam Nawawi's kind of conclusion here. It says, Mulla Ali al-Qari, consider. Right? Remember, he said, if there's anybody more knowledgeable than me on the face of the planet, he says, I would go to them. Right? But there isn't. Right? So I'm the most knowledgeable person on the planet. Right? So this is what he's saying. Right? So he's saying that no, there's no reason. He says if there's any ithm, whatever, then it's on that person. How can you say if somebody follows this now that he has done like he's a misguided fool, right? That's doing a bid'ah, and he's like, you know, and this is like a crazy thing to do. So he's saying that no, there's no reason to say this. And again, this brings us to an important issue. Um, Yeah, this brings us to another important issue, which is the whole discussion now, again on, oh, sorry, I didn't see this question. Based on the idea of having real asl in the Sharia, because prayer, recital, and salawat are all found within the Sharia, would there be an issue establishing salat al as a practice? This is what we're talking about, Faisal. This is what we're doing now. So this is what we're talking about. So let's see what happens. So this is Mulla Ali al-Qari. This is what he's saying, and of course he makes a statement which seems like extremely controversial, right? Where he kind of says that that even if it is fabricated, right? He says then the ithm is on that guy. There's no ithm on the one who does it, right? So in terms of actually, now this reality is again something which is it's very, very interesting because fuqaha have also spoken about this, right? So even Imam Tahtawi, so I'll read you what he says. So he says this in his Hashi on the Dul Mukhtar. So because when the ulama, because the Haskafi mentions that of course if it's mawdu' then you can't act in accordance with it. So Tahtawi comments, he says حيث كان مخالفا لقواعد الشريعة, right? He says this is when it's mukhalif and it goes against the qawaid of the Sharia. He says وأما لو كان داخلا في أصل عام فلا مانع منه, right? As for when it falls under a general asl which is established in the Sharia, then he says there's no harm in this. He says لا لجعله حديثا, right? But انتبهوا, right? Pay attention. He's saying not because this is a hadith, right? So you practice not because of hadith, but it's not a hadith, it's fabrication, right? But the question is, can you act in accordance with the fabrication now? That's a question, right? So he's saying yes if it falls under asl. He says بل لدخوله تحت الأصل العام, right? He says because it falls under a general asl in the Sharia, then he says it's impossible to even act in accordance with the fabrication. But of course, it's a fabrication, so that means it's not a hadith. But let's say somebody does this now, right? Some random thing that if you pray on the, what is it, 22nd of Rajab or something, right? Then you'll get 10 mountains of gold, right? Well, it doesn't mean anything, but 10, you get this beautiful palace in Jannah, right? So a complete fabrication. I just made it up right now, right? So just in case anybody decides to, but it's like something like this. Now you go and do it. You say, oh, that sounds like a nice thawab. So I'm going to pray 2 rakas, right? Lillahi ta'ala. What's the haram in this? At no point did you consider it to be a sunnah. At no point did you deem the fabrication to be legitimate, to be ascribed to the Prophet ﷺ, or to be a legitimate kind of practice within the Sharia as such, right? In that specific sense. And then you prayed. Is prayer established in the Sharia? Of course, like it's a general asl which is established in the Sharia. And then you did it. So you did it now. This is what he's talking about, right? So the reason for mentioning Tahtawi now is to show you that actually this is consistent with what other ulama said too, right? So this idea of even if it is a fabrication, it's not haram to act in accordance with it, right? As long as one doesn't ascribe it to the Sharia, doesn't deem it to be part of the Sunnah, doesn't deem it to be, obviously, like, the person who does it is deeming there's some type of merit, but it's a fabrication, right? But the idea is that you're inspired by it, right? So somebody does it, so they're inspired by it. Is that haram? So he's saying no, right? So anyway, you get the idea. Let's just read the next point as well, and then I'll mention something else about the Salat al-Ghaib. So he says, yeah, does Imam Nawawi object doing it, believing it's a sunnah? I mean, this is his whole statement. So look at his statement. Right? He's saying that this person who does it, he said this complete bid'ah, it's an innovation, it's complete misguidance and jahala. He said there's so many problems with the salat. He says, may Allah destroy the one who made it up. He says that many of the ulama have described how it's such a foul, an unsound kind of thing. And whoever prays it, he says, وَتَضْلِيلِ مُصَلِّيهَا, and misguidance of the one who prays it. Right? So he's very explicit with respect to his objection, like those other ulama. So he says, حكم تخصيص ليلة الجمعة بقيام ويوم الجمعة بصيام. Remember, what did he say? He said that hadith, he said, oh, you don't pray whatever. Because of that, then Salat al-Ghaib, you don't do it. So he says, وأما تخصيص ليلة الجمعة بالقيام ويوم الجمعة بالصيام فاختلف العلماء في كراهته. Right? So as for the dislikedness of praying in the night of Jum'ah, or specifying that night for prayer, and the day for fasting, he said the ulama have differed on this. He says, وَالْأَظْهَرُ أَنَّهُ مَحْمُولٌ عَلى الْكَرَاهَةِ التَّنْزِيهِيَّةِ. So if there's any karaha, then it's understood to be karaha tanzihiyya, which is slight karaha. It's khilaf al-awla, right? It's suboptimal. It's not haram. It's not impermissible. It's not makruh tahriman. It says, وَأَنَّ الْأَوْلَى هُوَ اسْتِدَامَةُ الْعِبَادَةِ فِي جَمِيعِ اللَّيَالِي. It's superior to pray all nights, right? Of course. But what if, like, it's Friday, it's a blessed day. Like, I'm going to pray on that day, right? So he's saying this is not ideal. It's not ideal because there's generally, like, praying at all times. This is superior to that. But if somebody does it and he says no haram, it's not haram. He says لن حصارها في وقت خاص منها. So لن حصارها في وقت خاص منها, a specific time, وتركها في باقيتها, and leaving it at other times. Like, I won't do it anytime, just do it on Fridays. He says كيف وفي جامع الأصول قال بعدما ذكر صلاة الرغائب. So in جامع الأصول, Ibn al-Athir, 7th century Shafi'i scholar, has a massive compendium where he gathered all of the major books of hadith. So he put all of the hadiths in order, right? So what did he do? I think it's alphabetical order as well. So in like all of the hadiths which relate to a certain issue, for example, from all of the books. So in Nasa'i and Ibn Majah it says this, and Bukhari it says, oh sorry, Bukhari Muslim, and then and he goes through, like Tirmidhi it says Ahmed says this, right, on the same hadith. So it's actually an amazing compendium that's gathered. Some of the ulama would actually read the entirety, like in Damascus, in Sham. They would read, some of the ulama would read the whole thing, like teach the whole thing, right, from beginning to end. So you actually taught like all the books of hadith as it were at one go. So after he mentioned Salatul Ghaib مع الكيفية المعروفة in its famously transmitted method, واستجابة الدعاء بعدها, and the acceptance of dua after it. Remember he said blessings on the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, then dua. وهذا الحديث مما وجدته في كتاب رازين ولم أجده في واحد من الكتب السنة أو الكتب الستة والحديث مطعون فيه. انتهى. So it's found in the book of Razin. He said I didn't find it in the Kutub Sitta, and he says, and people have objected, right? It's criticized this hadith. So he says, this is what Ibn Athir said. Then Mulla Ali al-Qari again. What does he say? وغايته أنه حديث ضعيف, right? And he said, worst case scenario, it's weak hadith, right? So again, he's saying it's not a fabrication, right? He's saying it's not a fabrication. He says, ويكفي في اعتباره أن شيخ ابن الصلاح. Again, can you see his hujjah? It's like these great scholars of the past, right? That's his hujjah. Like every now and again, like of course, look, he goes through the ilmi method, right? And then he says things, but then just as a secondary comment now, just like before he made a secondary comment. Right, so a secondary comment ويكفي في اعتباره أن الشيخ ابن الصلاح مع جلالته في علم الحديث اختار جواز تلك الصلاة. Right, so Ibn al-Salah said that it's permitted to pray this prayer. وكذا yeah وكذا حجة الإسلام في الإحياء وكذا وكذا حجة الإسلام في الإحياء أي إمام غزالي وكذا غيره من المشايخ والعلماء. So he's saying there's so many of the ulama, right, who said you can pray this prayer, right, Salatul Ghaib, right. So he's saying that they're all saying, let's see, he says وأما قول بعضهم, as for some of them saying إن صلاة الرغائب حدثت بعد المئة الرابعة فلا دلالة فيها على كونها بدعة سيئة لا سيما أصل الصلاة ثابت جوازها بالكتاب والسنة. So he says, as for some of them saying that Salatul Ghaib began after the 4th century, 5th century, he says, then there's no indication therein that it's considered to be a bid'ah sayyah. So, i.e., that even if it's established that people started doing it, as it were, after the 4th or 5th century, it doesn't make it a bid'ah, right? Just because people started doing it later doesn't make something a bid'ah. That's not how it works, right? If something has an asl in the sharia, right, then the idea is that it's always in accordance with qawa'id. Whatever happens, even if it happens 700 years later, after it's not just about that. Of course, that early time, the time of the Salaf, that has a special ahkam which relate to that period, right, especially with respect to the Sahaba and Tabi'een and so on. Abu Hanifa, of course, similarly is from the Tabi'een, right? So that's why what he says and his qawl is also of great i'tibar. But the idea is that even if something happens thereafter, it doesn't make it batil. Right, just because it happened afterwards, the idea is that we have to consider the act. So over here, so he's saying that even if it happened later on, that doesn't make it like some evil innovation, right? Because the bid'ah, remember, is of different categories. He says, "La siyama aslu salati thabitun." He says, especially given the prayer is established, already established. Right? Again, he's pointing you to the idea that there's an asl which is thabit in the Sharia. Yeah, and okay, so this actually, I don't think he mentions anything further. So this is why some of these other books now are important, right? So in the sense where they actually explore this issue in further detail, right? So I'll read you now what he says in Rada al-Raghib. Maybe not everything, but just a brief point, because what he does over here as well, and Hamawi also does this as well. He's the muhashi of the Ashbah al-Nadha'ir. So he's also 10th, 11th century. He writes a book where he quotes like all of the madahib. But a lot of the Hanafi ulama, what are they doing? What are they objecting to? This is the crux of the issue. They're objecting to congregational salatul raghaib. This is what the objection is. Why? Because there's already an asl which is established in the Hanafi school that you don't pray nawafil prayers in congregation. Right? Congregational nawafil prayers are a bid'ah. Right? They are not legislated, and this was the ishkal. And there were some Sufi types and Ottoman, maybe in Ottoman lands and elsewhere, where they were praying this prayer and they were doing specific things, like what they were vowing to pray the prayer so that it's not considered to be a nafilah. Because the prohibition, i.e. the bid'ah, as it were, is to pray a nafilah in congregation. So what did they do? They would vow the prayer so that it becomes a wajib prayer. So now you're praying a wajib prayer in congregation, and sometimes when you vow the same prayer as the imam, this is an exception to the rule, right? Because this is not a so this was like a legal hida which they were doing, and some of the ulama they said to do this, right? They said to do this, and this is why, for example, books like the Ashbah al-Nadha'ir, they actually mentioned this. Other books actually mentioned this as well, right? But some of the ulama came after that, and they really objected quite strongly to this. They said that this is crazy. Like what you're doing is not acceptable, right? Because you're trying to do something which you shouldn't be doing, as it were. Right, so you try and get out of it. So they actually said that this is batil. I don't have Hamawi here, that's why I can't read the specific thing. He doesn't say it here, but I'll tell you, Ibn Ghanim al-Maqdisi. Um, sorry, I didn't see the question. The point about specifying Jummah for extra tahajjud was specific to Rajab or throughout the year. No, it's just about Jummah generally. The hadith is general. Right, so what does he say? وبعد هذه المقدمة, where he just talks generally and brings from all different scholars, then he says المنقول في كتب مذهب الإمام الأعظم أبي حنيفة رضي الله تعالى عنه أن الجماعة في مثل هذه الصلاة بدعة مكروهة. Right, so praying this type of prayer, أي صلاة الرغائب in congregation, is مكروه. وهذا مقرر عند الفقيه النبي لا يحتاج فيه إلى تنبيه. He says every faqih knows this, right? Every Hanafi faqih knows this. It doesn't require any any further clarification. Like, you don't need to tell people because people already know this. And then he quotes Ibn al-Humam, and then he quotes where he's talking about this specific issue of praying in congregation, right? I nawafil prayers, like, this is not done. And then he quotes the Bazzaziyah, and he talks about this idea. He says وَكَذَا اقْتِدَاءُ النَّاذِرِ بِالنَّاذِرِ لَا يَجُوزُ, right? That somebody praying a nadhar behind somebody praying a vowed prayer behind a vowed prayer. He says وعلى هذا كره الاقتداء في صلاة الرغائب, right? So what does he say in the Bazzaziyah in 9th century, great book, Abu Sa'ud Imadi was the Shaykh of Islam, the Ottoman Empire. They were said to him, why don't you write a book of fiqh? He says, why do we need it? We have the Bazzaziyah. Right. So Fatawa al-Bazzaziyah, it's on the hamish, the margins. It's like printed as margin 80 on the Fatawa al-Hindiyah, the old print. There's also Darul Kutub al-Ilmiyah, have like a 2-volume edition of it, which is not necessarily so reliable, but anyway. So he says كره الاقتداء, right? كره الاقتداء في صلاة الرغائب. So he says, so praying صلاة الرغائب now behind the imam, right? So this iqtida, this is what is makruh. He says وصلاة البراءة. Not only that, he mentions a bunch of other وصلاة القدر وليلة القدر ولو بعد النذر. And he says even if it's after a vow. So he says إلا إذا قال نذرت كذا ركعة مقتديا بهذا الإمام بالجماعة. Except if he specifies a specific thing to pray behind the imam with a specific number of rak'ahs. He says لعدم إمكان الخروج عن العهدة إلا بالجماعة, because then he can't lift this wajib except by praying in the congregation. But he says ولا ينبغي أن تكلف لالتزام ما لم يكن في الصدر الأول كل هذا تكليف لإقامة مكروه. Right, but he says, but he shouldn't go to all of these lengths to do something which which number one, he says Sadr al-Awwal, like the early the first generation, as it were, but he says to do something which is makruh, وهو أداء نفل بجماعة على سبيل التداعي, which is to pray, like he's going to all of this length, right, to make the vow and everything, so he can effectively pray an nafila in jama'ah, right? So he's saying that, why are you doing this, right? This is not acceptable. So he says أقول, Ibn Qasim al-Maqdisi now, فهذا التكلف. Again, did I mention him? But he's like 11th century. Inshallah, in the next risala reading, I'll give a brief bio of him. But he's 11th century Egyptian scholar. The Asanid run through Ibn Ghanim al-Maqdisi, right? The Hanafi Sanad of Tafaqquh runs through Ibn Ghanim al-Maqdisi, right? So he's a very significant scholar. He says فهذا التكلف إنما التزم لصحة الاقتداء لا لجواز الفعل ونفي الكراهة لتصريحه بقوله لإقامة مكروه. So he says, so he does all of this in order to validate the prayer, not to say that it's permissible to do it, right? That's all he was affirming. He says فإن قلت ذكر هذه الصلاة الغزنوي في مقدمته, right? So this is why Ibn Ghanim is saying now. الغزنوي in his مقدمة الغزنوية. Again, the مقدمة الغزنوية is a 6th century. Yeah, I think 6th century, early 7th century. Right, so he mentions this in his muqaddimah. He says, قلت وقال شارحها في الضياء المعنوي. Right, الضياء المعنوي now is by Ibn al-Diya, and he is 9th century, I believe. And what does he say? He has the Diya al-Ma'nawi, which is published. Diya al-Ma'nawi is published, right? So what does he say? He says وأما فعلها بجماعة. Right, look And look how specific they are. Look what they keep talking about. They keep talking about Jama'ah, Jama'ah, Jama'ah. And this is the key point that I want is this is the key takeaway from this, right? And you'll see this recurring theme. He said فلا شك أنه يكره, right? وذكر من زيادة البدعة فيها أنهم يسجدون بعد الفراغ منها سجدة وتلك سجدة لا يعرف لها أصل, and so he also mentions that they also prostrate. I didn't actually see that, so I actually searched for it in the Al-Manawi, and maybe I looked a bit too quickly, but I didn't see them mentioning anything about this extra sajda, because he mentions that there's a sajda over here, an extra sajda that they do. Yeah, actually, he does mention it. So he says, قلت وأما فعلها بالجماعة فلا شك أنه يكره. قلت وينبغي من الضيانة وينبغي إذا أراد أن يسجد سجدتين بعدها أن يقرأ آية سجدة. So in the Mulla Ali al-Qari's version of it, there's no sujood. But there's actually one of the reasons why Al-Izz ibn Abd al-Salam, Sultan and ulama, and others wrote against this. Why? Because there's no such thing as doing just a random sajda. Right? So also in the Hanafi school said that shukr, for example, this is not acceptable. Right? This is makruh. The asl is karaha عند Abi Hanifa. Right? Because it doesn't have like its own, there's only one case, like in the case of Nas, which is sajdat tilawa. It's the only case where it's considered to be legitimate to do a sajda in and of itself. Otherwise, this has no asl. You can't do a sajda just by itself. It doesn't function. That's why he says, وينبغي إذا أراد أن يسجد سجدتين بعدها أن يقرأ آية سجدة. So does he say, oh, it's haram, it's makruh, whatever? No, he actually gives you a solution. He says, do the recite a verse of prostration, and he says, then prostrate. Right? So he says, لأنه يكره التطوع بسجدة بلا سبب. It's amazing, right? This is the point I'm trying to get across. That look, they're not just turning around and saying, oh, haram. The only problem that they have, and the problems which are arising, they're actually solving them. Right? So the ulama previously, like, okay, like, they did the vow thing, like some of the ulama mentioned the vow, but the others, they didn't like that, which is fine, absolutely fine, that's acceptable. But now they're only objecting to the idea of the congregation. Nobody is objecting to the prayer itself, right? Because there's nothing problematic apparently in the prayer. Now, if you add these additional sujood, then this becomes an issue. So this is why he resolves it here. Ibn al-Diya he has one of the great books on the Hajj. Right, and he's also quite firm against bid'ah and everything as well. Like you read his book on the Hajj, like he has 5 thick volumes on the Al-Bahr al-Amiq. But anyway, so this is what he mentions over here. And the other thing, which I'll come back to, uh, inshallah. Um, let me see. Some, I don't know, man, say Nafil can be prayed in Jama'ah if there's a benefit for Jama'ah, especially Salah. Benefit for Jama'ah, especially Salah, with long recitation, difficult for people to pray themselves. Is there a general Hanafi fatwa on this? No. It's there's mansus fil madhab that there's no Jama'ah. Of course, like maybe some contemporary scholars, like just generally in communities, might recommend, for example, to do something, might take a rukhsah from the madhab or something, and might do it. But there's nothing that's clear in the madhab that you can't pray nafila prayers in congregation. Why? Because congregational prayer is khilaf al-qiyas anyway, so it only applies in specific cases. You can only pray in specific cases, and that's understood even from many masail where, for example, if the imam doesn't show up for the eclipse prayer, how people pray alone. Other examples where across the fiqh where they say, of course, the tahqiq al-Bahir, who's a later Uskudari scholar on his sharh on the Ashbah, he does actually indicate, but I say it seems like his own bahth and his own ijtihad, where he deems it to be cool. to pray nafila prayers. And to be honest, it's probably why some of this stuff was happening, perhaps in Ottoman lands, because some of the ulama were maybe deemed it to be kind of acceptable. But in terms of the Zahir al-Madhab and the authorities of the Madhab, it's pretty clear that there's no such thing. And Halwani, who has the fatwa, who's the Sheikh of Sarakhsi, with respect to the idea of tada'i, that can you do it, for example, if there's only a couple of people, or up to 3 people, there's a debate on it. That's the extent of his fatwa. So there's no such, there's nothing beyond that with respect to there being, and that's also a spontaneous thing. It's not like people are called to pray, like calling to people to pray. That's a bid'ah, right? So I don't know if anything else within the madhab. If you know something, please do let me know, inshallah. He also mentions here وقال في كتاب النذور ولم يذهب أحد إلى أن السجدة وحدها تلزم بالنذر. Right, so if somebody makes a vow to perform a prostration itself, فإنها ليست عبادة إلا مقرونة بسبب. Right, so it's only an ibadah when there's some type of sabab for it, like the tilawa as we talked about. He says فمن العجائب أن من يدعي أنه حنفي كيف يدعو إلى الجماعة في نحو صلاة الرغائب. This is what he says, right? He says it's after wonders. He says, how can somebody claim to be a Hanafi? Look what he says, right? يدعي أنه حنفي, right? They claim and call themselves Hanafi. He says كيف يدعو إلى الجماعة? How can he call people to pray صلاة الرغائب in Jama'ah? Again, note how he says Raghaib. Like 2 things here to note. The Jama'ah of Salatul Raghaib, he's not objecting to the prayer itself necessarily. Like so, like even though he's going to mention something from the whatever in just a second, but also the fact that he calls out Hanafis, right? Again, people, because they they don't necessarily do the reading, whatever. It's like literally, this is all about 400. Like, look what he's saying. فمن العجائب أن من يدعي أنه حنفي, right? He claims to be a Hanafi, right? Look how he phrases it as well. Like what kind of Hanafi would say this? That's what he's saying, right? You're saying you're Hanafi, but like this is not what Hanafi does. It's not the madhab. How can you say this? It's really important. Challenging a Hanafi, yeah, exactly. what do you say? وقال ابن أمير حاد في شرح منية المصلي قال الشيخ زين الدين ابن رجب no, that's not what I want. Anyway, I thought he was going to say something else about Munia. So I'm leave Nuruddin al-Maqdisi for now. One more point I'll mention from this on the al-Ma'nawi, and then I'll share something else. But you can see here how, again, the whole thing is about the Jama'ah, right? So, and the other who's writing against it, of course, like the ulama from all the madhabs. But you can see here now, even though he's quoted from all the madhabs, his Hanafi discussion, right, and the madhab discussion is simply on this idea of the Jama'ah, right? This idea of the Jama'ah and some of the things. So ideas that if you were to ask him, like, don't pray in Jama'ah, right, and don't do the sajdas because you don't like them, even though the Diya al-Ma'nawi, he already gave a solution, right? He already gave a solution. But let's just say you don't do it according to what Mulla Ali al-Qari said. Is Ibn al-Qanim going to have an issue? I don't think he would. And that's why Ghaznawi mentions this salat. That's why, for example, this is al-Hawi al-Qudsi as well. In the Hawi al-Qudsi, it's also Ghaznawi. I can't remember now if it's the same Ghaznawi. I should probably know this, but I'm confused in my mind because there's 2 famous Ghaznawis. But anyway, he says he's the same. Okay, good. That's good. So he says ولا يصلى تطوعا بجماعة غير التراويح. Right. So look how this is now he's معاصر لصاحب الهداية. Al-Hawi al-Qudsi is, again, an early book. It's a very important book as well. Right. So he mentions that you don't pray in congregation except the Taraweeh prayer. So only congregational nafila prayer. Actually, I mean, there's some others as well. But anyway, he's just making a point here. He says وما روي في الصلاة في الأوقات الشريفة Right? So as for the prayers which are transmitted, in Hawi al-Qudsi is saying this. At specific times, he says, كَلَيْلَةِ الْقَدْرِ وَلَيْلَةِ النِّصْفِ مِنْ شَعْبَانِ وَلَيْلَةِ الْعِيدَيْنِ وَعَرَفَةِ وَالْجُمُعَةِ. Remember Jum'ah from earlier? He says, وَغَيْرِهَا تُصَلَّى فُرَادًا. What does he say? He says, all of those prayers which have been transmitted, pray them alone. Don't pray them in the group. Right, that's al-Hawi al-Qudsi now. That's Hawi al-Qudsi. Similarly, over here, in again in the Diya al-Manawi, he after this just put Salat al-Ghaib to a side just for a second. He mentions here, where is it? Sorry, I lost the page. Because in the Ghazali, he mentions like a number of prayers now. So one of them is the what he calls the prayers of the nights of the week and the days. So he says, وَرَأَيْتُ أَنْ أُلْحِقَ بِهَذِهِ الصَّلَوَاتِ sorry, it's not Al-Ghazali, sorry, it's just the Diya al-Manawi himself, he mentions this. أُلْحِقَ بهذه الصلوات صلاة ليالي الأسبوع وأيامه. He says معتمدا في ذلك على ما نقله ثلاثة من العلماء العاملين والأولياء الصادقين. He said based on these أولياء عاملين or أولياء صادقين said, he says العارفين بالله خائفين الخاشعين. خائفين الخاشعين. أبو طالب المكي في قوت القلوب والشيخ عبد القادر الجيلاني right في الغنية. He says والغافقي الإمام محدث التاريخ في لمحات الأنوار. Right? And then he mentions وهي مشهورة في مراكش ونواحيها ومواظبون عليها. Right? That they prayed these prayers. So then he lists out all the prayers. And of course, some of these prayers are listed now even by others. Right? Like Imam Ghazali, like is mentioning some of these prayers at the line. So I mentioned how we'll see, and then I mentioned now, of course, these types of things. Aman, you're gonna have to type out. Sorry, your question. But this is now the Hadith Ibn al-Imad of al-Imadi, the Mufti of Damascus, with the shop of Abdul Ghani al-Nabulsi. Again, with the section on Salat al-Raghaib. Right? So in Salat al-Raghaib, he says, وَقَالَ والدي, right? His sheikh and his father, Ismail Nabusi. وقال شارح النقايا ولا يكره الاقتداء بالإمام في النوافل مطلقا نحو القدر والرغاء وليلة النصف من شعبان ونحو ذلك. Sorry, I mean I had this saved and everything, and I read it before as well. When you asked me the question, I guess it slipped my mind. So I guess there is this minority, right, of like the odd kind of person saying this, right? So you can see here that Sharif al-Nuqaya, I'm not sure who he means, perhaps Quhustani or somebody else, but he says we'll have to check when Quhustani's Sharif al-Nuqaya is published. So he says اقتداء بالإمام في النوافل مطلقا نحو القدر والرغائب, right? So he mentions you can pray رغائب together. وليلة النصف من شعبه ونحو ذلك لأن ما رآه المسلمون حسنا فهو عند الله حسن انتهى. Now, of course, this is not necessarily a reliable book, right? So this is why he says, عبد الغني النابلسي, he says, فلعل ذلك في اقتداء الواحد والاثنين. Right? So this has that wheel of it, right? So what's the that wheel? That wheel is just one or two people, right? Even though the you can understand like there's an ihtimal in the ibara. So he says, he said كما تقدم وإلا فالمسلمون لا يرون البدعة في الدين حسنة. Why? Because praying in congregation, i.e. nafila prayers in congregation is bid'ah. Right? So Muslims will never say this is a good thing to do. لأن المسلم المواظب على اتباع السنة ولم يعهد أمثال هذه الصلاة بجماعة. It's never, we've never seen this. Like people don't like, in terms of like, it's not been transmitted that they would pray these prayers in congregation. Right? They would mention them, but they're not. He says, فالصواب الكراهة على قاعدة مذهبنا والله أعلم. And again, that it's makruh to pray in congregation. Again, that's that. Halbatul Majali. Everyone with me? Am I losing people? There's too much information. It's a sharh on Munyatul Musallina. Sharh on Munyatul Musallina. Again, you can see what's his objection. Mm, doing this fast, so I do apologize if I missed something. صلاة yeah معروفة بصلاة الرغائب. So I just want to get to the point where he mentions. Yeah, so this is just the final point that he mentions here. He just says ومن هنا يعلم أن الجمع الذي يفعل في ليلة النصف من شعبان وأول جمعة من رجب, right? ونحو ذلك بدعة مكروهة. Again, you can see now in the first Rajab, i.e. the Salatul Raghaib, again, right? This idea of that you pray it at this time, he says بدعة مكروهة. وقد نص جماعة من الأصحاب على ذلك. بل, right? So this is, i.e. of praying it together, this is a problem. بل لو قيل بتحريم ذلك ما بعد. Right? But if you deemed it to be haram, like would it be far-fetched? Yeah. So this is a discussion. Anyway, that's a final thing that I might have, because I was doing it quickly, I have to double check if that's even Amir Hajj. But anyway, the point is that it's the zahir is that it is. The zahir is that it's Amir Hajj. But the point of all of this is, again, to just show how all of these ulama are mentioning it. Sorry, there's one more nas as well. What was the other nas that I wanted to share with you? Sorry, of course there's more. This is just me being a quick thing. It's not like I have like a whole research paper on this. I'm just trying to share something beyond the book, right? Um, so yeah, Sheikh Ismail An-Nabulsi, again, this Ibn Abdin quotes him in the Minhatul Khaliq. So what does he say? What does he say? He says, وَيَنْبَغِي حَمْلُهُ عَلَى الْانْفِرَادِ. Right? Did you turn around and say it's like a bid'ah haram, makruh, we can't do it? No. These aren't muhaddithin, these are fuqaha. Right? So the ishkal, like, and there's only an ishkal now. If you do like these, you have to do these prostrations, and people do these random prostrations, then of course they would find this highly problematic. But Ibn al-Diya obviously offers a solution. We can see others where they're not necessarily talking about the prostrations, there might be different versions of it. They don't necessarily consider that to be problematic, right? I.e., as a prayer that somebody prays alone. If you do it alone, it's not necessarily an issue. Anyway, I hope I haven't lost everybody, but let me just read the last section now, and I think inshallah we'll call it a night. I'll keep my comments brief. He says, بديعية الوقيد والاجتماع في أول جمعة من رجب. So, I mean, that's pretty much the extent of what I wanted to say about Salat al-Raqaib, which was a key part of tonight's, this evening's discussion with respect to this risala. So I hope that there was something useful in that discussion. He said بداعية الوقيد والاجتماع في أول جمعة من رجب. So أما اتخاذ تلك الليلة مجتمعة, he says بزيادة الوقيد فيها وفي أمثالها فلا شك أنها بدعة سيئة وفعلة منكرة لما فيها من إسراف الأموال والتشبه بعبدة النار في إظهار الأحوال. Yeah, so as using these nights to gather and to increase, I guess, in some type of lighting and the like, that they would do, take lamps and that type of thing. He says that this is considered to be a bid'ah and a bad thing to do. He says because it's just wasting money and also resembling the abadat al-nar. But there was a specific way that they would do it. They would do it also at Muzdalifah and Arafat and those types of places as well. So the ulama didn't really like this type of thing that they would do, because kind of resembles like the Magians and that type of thing. He says, من منكرات ما يقع في رجب, so of the munkarat now which happens in Rajab, he says, وكذا من المنكرات خلط النساء والرجال وضرب الدف والترقيص مما ينافي أحوال أرباب الكمال. Similarly, of the munkarat is the mixing of men and women together and the hitting the duff and the dancing and prancing around. He says, which all of which negates the ahwal of the perfected of the awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and those who are noble and righteous, that they wouldn't engage in such things. But again, these types of things would also happen on at Hajj at Arafat. right? Just read the old books. You can see the ulama doing inkar of it, right? So it's just one thing where they're just kind of saying, okay, well, something perhaps is happening, and he's in Mecca as well, so maybe it's something that he's seeing in Masjid al-Haram, right? Or something that's happening. So then he says, صلاة ليلة المعراج, again, another type of prayer. He says, هذا وذكر شيخ مشايخنا حافظ السيوطي في جامعه الكبير. All the spoken hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ, which are transmitted irrespective of the whether it's sound or not. He said في رجب ليلة كتب للعامل فيه حسنات 100 سنة وذلك لثلاث بقين من رجب فمن صلى فيه 12 ركعة يقرأ في كل ركعة فاتحة الكتاب وسورة من القرآن يتشهد في كل ركعتين ويسلم في آخرهن ويقول بعد صلاته سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر 100 مرة ويستغفر 100 مرة ويصلي على النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وعليه السلام 100 مرة ويدعو لنفسه ما شاء من أمر دنياه وآخرته ويصبح صائما فإن الله يستجيب دعاءه كله إلا أن يدعو في معصية. Right, so again, this concept of somebody on Laylatul Mi'raj, right? Laylatul Mi'raj, something that he'll talk about shortly as well. He says the 12 rak'ahs, they recite the Quran, some, Fatiha and something of the Quran, and so on and so forth. And he does this and he recites certain dhikr thereafter, and then he fasts the following day. Then there's a great thawab for this. He says, رواه البيهقي عن أبان عن أنس بإسناد ضعيف جدا. So he mentions ضعيف جدا for the first time. Yeah. He said, وقد صرح في الإحياء بأنه صلاة ليلة المعراج. But of course, you've already seen others already mentioning it, right? The Laylat al-Mi'raj, the salat of it. It's mentioned in many places. Again, the ishkal would be, light of everything we've covered it is like the jama'ah for it and deeming it to be a sunnah, deeming it to be important, and so on. And that's why, what was the risala that I was going to read? The other point I was going to make. um, um, I can't remember if it's in Rajab Raghib, but it relates to what I just said, but I just can't remember now. But خيرا إن شاء الله نصيب. He says التعجب من تحسين المعصية على صلاة الرغائب. وأما ما حكي من أن بعض المالكية مر بقوم يصلون الرغائب وقوم عاكفين على محرم من المصائب فحسن حال العاصين على المصلين معللا بأنهم يعلمون أنهم في معصية فلعلهم يتوبون وهؤلاء يزعمون أنهم في عبادة فلا يرجعون. He says فهذا أمر غريب وحكم عجيب فسبحان الله هل يتصور أن تكون نفس الصلاة معصية مبتدعة وإن كانت على هيئة مخترعة حتى يحتاج صاحبها إلى توبة وهو يطلب من الله بفعلها المغفرة والرحمة. So he says some of the Malikis, right, some Maliki guy, he passed by somebody who were praying Raghaib and others who were engaged in Masiyah. So he said that the people engaged in Masiyah, then they know they're in Masiyah, so perhaps they will repent. And the people who engage in the Salat, then they think they're doing something praiseworthy, so they'll never return from this. And so he said that this is, Mulla Ali said this is extremely strange. How can you say that the prayer is considered to be a Masiyah? And even if it has a form which is not normal, which is, I guess we'd have to interpret what exactly that means. He says such that the person needs tawbah. Perhaps he means like with the idea of, the prostrations afterwards or something like that, even though he didn't mention that in his thing. But we'd have to do some type of ta'wil for what exactly he means, because we saw the Salatul Raghaib would just, it was just a basic prayer with like Surah Al-Qadr and Surah Al-Ikhlas. Right? There's nothing like troublesome, problematic else which manifests within the prayer itself. He says, ثم إن فتح باب قبح كل بدعة حادثة يرجح في المذمة على معصية ثابتة لما خلص أحد من العلماء الأعلام ولا من المشايخ الكرام من الذنوب والآثام ويضم إليه إنكار اللسان على الأمور المحرمة في هذا الزمان فنسأل الله العفو والعافية وحسن الخاتمة في العاقبة والتوفيق في المتابعة بالكتاب والسنة ومخالفة أهل الأهواء والبدعة السيئة ويكفي في هذا المقام الأعلى قوله تعالى أرأيت الذي ينهى عبدا إذا صلى. This is his response that the one who prohibits the abd when he prays. Right, so this is the khulasa of his. How can you say that's a bad thing? even if it's problematic, he's saying the story is like is complete batil. Right. He says, and if you open this door of deeming every new thing to be like a problem, he says, then you'd end up with this all types of fasad, right? So you end up with um, and all types of dhunub that even with the ulama would be doing. Okay, so العمرة في رجب. He says بقي الكلام على عمرة رجب أما كونها سنة بأن فعلها عليه السلام أو أقر بها أحدا أو راغب فيها فلا يثبت. فقد روي عن عروة ابن الزبير قال كنت أنا وابن عمر مستندين إلى حجرة عائشة وإنا نسمع صوتها بالسواك تستن أو تستك قال هي brushing your teeth. So he says, sorry, as for the Umrahs of Rajab, he says, as for there being a sunnah because Prophet ﷺ did it or affirmed that somebody did it and deemed it to be acceptable and so on or encouraged it, he said this is not established. So he says, there's a case of Sayyida Aisha, فقلت يا أبا عبد الرحمن اعتبر النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم في رجب قال نعم فقلت لعائشة أي أمتا ألا تسمعين ما يقول أبو عبد الرحمن قالت وما يقول قلت يقول اعتبر النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم 4 عمر إحداهن في رجب فقالت يغفر الله لأبي عبد الرحمن لعمري ما اعتمر في رجب وما اعتمر في عمرة إلا وهو معه وما اعتمر في رجب قط قال وابن عمر يسمع ما قال لا ولا نعم سكت كذا في المواهب اللدنية في قسطلاني وهذا يدل على وهم ابن عمر سواء رجع عن قوله أو لا فإنه متفرد به وقوله شاذ منكر لم يوافقه أحد من الصحابة الكرام ولا من الأئمة الأعلام. So it's just this whole story with respect to that did he do the Prophet ﷺ and Umrah in the month of Rajab. So she's saying that no, he didn't. Right? So yeah. So he's saying that no, that's a khulasa. Then he says this indicates that Ibn Umar made a mistake here. So I guess he was saying something here. اعتبر النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول اعتبر النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم 4 عمر إحداهن في رجب. So يغفر الله لأبي عبد الرحمن العمري ما اعتمر في رجب. Right? Yeah, so he didn't say anything. So he says سواء رجع عن قوله أو لا فإنه متفرد. So he has like this shares opinion that the ulama didn't accept that. He's saying he says no, the ulama agreed that he actually the Prophet ﷺ did Umrah at this time. Okay. So he says نعم روي أن عبد الله ابن الزبير لما جدد بناء الكعبة الشريفة وضعها على هيئة منيفة وكان الفراغ قبيل 27 من رجب بليالي متعددة وذبح قرابين للفقراء والمساكين أمر أهل مكة أن يعتمروا حينئذ شكرا لله على إتمام بيت الله الملك العلام بنظام أحبه النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وذلك أن الصحابة الكرام أقوالهم وأفعالهم حجة على الأنام حيث قال صلى الله عليه وسلم أصحابي كالنجوم بأيهم اقتديتم اهتديتم مع ما ورد عن ابن مسعود رضي الله تعالى عنه موقوفا ومرفوعا ما رآه المسلمون حسنا فهو عند الله حسن. So he says so even if that's not established, then he said that we also have this riwayah from Abdullah ibn Zubayr when he renewed the building of the Kaaba and he made it in a certain way. And he said this was just before the 27th of Rajab, right? Shortly before 27th of Rajab. He says, so he slaughtered many animals, gave it to the fuqara and masakin, and then he commanded the people of Mecca to perform the Umrah out of a sense of shukr, right? And he says, yeah. So he said, yeah, just Umrah, right? So sorry, I thought I was in my mind it was something else. Yeah, يعتمروا. So to perform the Umrah. So he said that the what the Sahaba do now, this is a hujjah, right? So this is a hujjah that there's some proof which manifests through this. So he says that because the hadith Ashabi al-Nujum, so whichever like stars, whichever you follow, you'll be guided. He says also Abdullah ibn Mas'ud said what the Muslims deem to be good, then that's good according to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وهذا مع توافقه لليلة It says قيل كان في معراج سيد الأنبياء إلى السماوات العلى ودنوه إلى مقام قاب قوسين أو أدنى وهذا وجه تخصيص أهل مكة للزيارة لشهر رجب الأعظم والله تعالى أعلم وصلى الله تعالى على. Okay, so this is so he says this also corresponds to a night. So either happened on this night, or it's closely said that it was the night of the Mi'raj of the Prophet ﷺ. He says that this is the reason for why they specify, it seems, أهل مكة لزيارة شهر رجب الأصم. And also because, like the visitation and the Umrah and everything at this time, because also the idea of the Mi'raj happened at this time. So he doesn't really comment any further on that. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. Yeah, because this is Sabi' al-Ashrin, right, 27. So he says, وصلى الله تعالى على محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. So I do apologize, that was a bit longer than I was expecting, but that's basically al-Adab fi Rajab. So I pray that that was a beneficial reading and there was some fawa'id which came out of it. And thanks to everybody for your engagement and the like. As for this final question, yeah, really community celebration on certain days that have weak evidence was ruling participating, visiting graves, handing out 18 sweets over there, and 15 Shaban is done in India. If it's done in India, then Indians can figure it out. But if it's being done somewhere else, then it's like a thing. But it's like for a lot of things, like there's you have to remember that we want to do it from a fiqh perspective, not just a hadithi perspective, right? So that's why I mentioned all of the other details as well, what the ulama have said, what Mulla Ali al-Qari has said. Again, you don't want to take him as a hujjah. That's why I tried to show like other ulama also saying similar types of things for various issues. So the point is not that everybody go away and pray Salatul Ghaib. That's not the point. I mean, the time's passed anyway. It's the first Jummah of Rajab, right? So it's not about that, right? But it's just about the ilmi qawa'id. The point is that we walk away, we benefited ilmiyan, right, in an ilmi way from reading this risala, and that's the point of all of these rasa'il. So it's not that somebody goes and actually think, but the idea is that transformation is part of the ilm that we gain and how it changes our outlook and how it changes the way that we do ilm and how we engage with the ulama and the books and the nusus and everything. So I pray that and that was useful, and inshallah, like I said, um, inshallah, I'll try to do the next one before the month of Ramadan. And thanks to everybody for your participation. And barakallahu ta'ala fikum. Please keep me your du'as and let me know your feedback, inshallah. وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله